This happened when I was out with some friends of mine, just off the coast of Washington. My friend Todd had this really cool boat. I honestly don't know enough about boats to tell you what kind it was, or what you would call it even, but it was a fairly decent-sized vessel. It was large enough for the 5 of us to be more than comfortable. It had an inner chamber with a small kitchen, bathroom, and even bunks to sleep on as well. Quite a nice thing, all in all. Now, Todd really liked being out on the ocean because he felt it was the freest place a person could be. He would often drive out to international waters to explore. I could never really understand his desire to do that. Not only was he getting way too far away from the shore, scary to me already, but I'd heard that in international waters, there were pretty much not any laws at all. Now, whether or not that's actually true, I don't really know enough to say. I also didn't ask because I didn't want Todd to think I was a moron. Later in the day on this outing, Todd was getting the itch, so to speak, to go out and explore further away from the coast. I made some mild objections, but didn't really want to appear like a big wuss in front of my buddies. I didn't object too strongly because of this. For the most part, I thought Todd knew what he was doing. I was a complete novice when it came to anything out in the water, so better to trust him instead of trying my own stuff. We had been cruising along for quite a long time. Despite my initial fear, I was now sitting up front on the ship and enjoying the amazing view. The ocean was so enormous. Thinking about how large it was made me feel dizzy, but it was pretty awesome. It had been a while since we'd seen anything but water, though. While I was sitting there watching, I did notice something seemingly moving up in the distance. Immediately, I called Todd's attention over to it. He told me it was just another boat and not to worry about it. Probably just some other people doing the exact same thing we were doing. He then, though, had the genius idea to go up to them and see what they were up to. I was absolutely against this. I had no problem indicating so to Todd. However, he just brushed me off immediately. It was his boat and he was going to do what he wanted to do. So we slowly headed off in the direction of that boat. Little by little, we came closer and closer to the ship. Todd was going fairly slowly, I guess so as to not surprise them. They hadn't really indicated they had seen us, though. As we got closer, I noticed this boat was not nearly as nice as Todd's was. It was about the same size and looked like it had an inside compartment as well, but we didn't see anybody on deck. It was not moving either. Now, you'll have to forgive me again if you're a boating person. As I mentioned before, I don't really know much. For me, all I know is turn the boat on and it goes vroom. When the boat gave no indication that it was aware we were there, and because it seemed like it was adrift, Todd got a bit more cautious. He tried to radio in to the other boat, but he got no response from them. He was quite worried now that something must be wrong. We approached the boat carefully. We kept a decent distance, though, because the last thing any of us wanted was a collision. Todd knew what he was doing, thankfully, as he maneuvered us a bit closer. I have to admit, this was a bit of a rush. I was worried that something bad had happened to whoever was on the boat, but the mystery of this all was so exciting. When we were very, very close, where we would have communicated verbally if someone was there, I started to notice some movement. Suddenly, a very short man came sprinting out on deck. He was the gnarliest looking man I'd ever seen, dressed in ragged clothes and a long scraggly beard. He also only had one arm. He was holding a knife in his hand, and he was covered in blood. The little man began to scream at us. "Come closer, you fuckers, so I can slice you up." He yelled some other obscenities too. Alarmed, I jumped back. When I did, I saw another man come onto deck. He was much larger than the other guy, and he was carrying a gun. He had a much different message for us than the dwarf. He pointed the gun at us and commanded, "You turn the fuck around!" The dwarf ran over to the wheel and started the engine, looking over at Todd as he did so. I don't think Todd needed to be told twice. He turned the boat around and we sped off. Fortunately, even though it seemed the smaller man wanted to come after us, Todd's boat was faster and we lost them very quickly. He didn't slow down until the boat was completely out of sight, and we saw the land again. I'm not entirely sure what to think about what happened. Todd was freaked out, but later he told me he thought it might have been a joke. I was shocked and asked him how he could have possibly come to that conclusion. He then told me if he had looked like a pirate and was in a boat in the middle of nowhere and had seen a group of people like us, he would have played a similar prank. I don't think that's the case, though. It really scared the crap out of me, at least. I'm a fisherman from Long Island. My boat is not huge, and I'm not full-time either. I would never be able to make a living off of what I catch alone. I do make a little bit of money off of it, though, and wouldn't stop doing it for the world. That's because I just really enjoy it. I had a really weird experience a few years ago, however, that made me a little bit hesitant to venture out for a couple of days. I had a bad case of Murphy's Law, which led to me experiencing something pretty chilling. I went out fishing with my buddy Dan. I need at least one other person to man the boat with me. We had gone out pretty far, because, well, you have to if you really want to catch anything good. The water around New York, other than being terribly polluted in certain areas, just isn't rich in fish until you stray pretty far out. The first thing that went wrong? We kept on having problems with our equipment the entire day. That should have been a warning signal to us that this wasn't going to work out. Rather, we just treated it as a challenge, though. The second thing that went wrong is the fish weren't biting at all. And I mean at all. It was one of the worst days I've ever had. You'd think we would have given up and gone home, but we were already going this far, so we had to keep trying. We stayed out longer than we ever had before. We decided that once the sun began setting without a single bite all day long, we needed to head back in for the night. That's when the third thing went wrong, of course. The damn engine on my boat broke down. We tried to fix it, or at least fiddle around with it as it were, but there wasn't a whole lot we could do. We had to radio in for help. Yeah, can you see where this is going? Fourth thing that went wrong, our radio immediately went on the fritz. Just one thing after the other. The sunset was beautiful, but it didn't last long enough for my taste. We were now adrift in the middle of the ocean, with no way of contacting anyone. I sent out an SOS signal, and at least that was working. I didn't get a reply though, so that was pretty discouraging. With the darkness came the cold as well. We could go into the boat, but because we were adrift, we couldn't just stay under and wait. We had to be on deck long enough to tell what was going on. It wouldn't do to have a big ship come along and crush us, or even a smaller, less friendly boat coming by without us knowing. Plus, the possibility of hitting anything was terrifying. At one point, though, it was just so cold that Dan and I both had to go below deck to get warmed up for a few moments. My lights were working fine still, thank God. Then something happened, though. The entire boat shook, and there was a huge noise as if we just collided with something. I immediately cursed at myself for staying below deck for too long. Of course, this was the day something like this would happen. The cracking sound and reverberation of the hit wasn't severe, so more than likely it was just something like a buoy. Even a buoy, though, could cause enough damage to sink a smaller boat. Even worse, though, immediately after the collision, all lights in the boat and on deck shut off. If you've never experienced pitch dark away from a city, you won't be able to understand what happened. It was completely dark. You couldn't see a single thing. Dan and I immediately shot up and knocked some things over. Fortunately, we were able to stumble around until we found the flashlight. Once we could see a bit, I told Dan to grab the lantern, get it lit, and meet me up on deck. I had to run up to see if we had hit something. I sprinted onto the deck and immediately froze when I saw something I cannot explain to this day. Standing on the bow of the ship was a person, an honest-to-God person. He was dressed like a fisherman as far as I could tell, but even with the flashlight shining on him, I could barely make him out. I could tell the man was looking at me, but he wasn't doing anything. He just stood there staring. Dan ran up behind me with the lantern. As he did, he saw the figure standing there too. He dropped the lantern as he yelled out in surprise. The lantern went out, and now we only had the light of the flashlight to go by. I tried to call out to the strange man, but as I opened my mouth, he leaned backwards and fell off the bow of the ship and into the water. Dan and I were terrified. We ran to the bow and tried to look over, but it was so dark we couldn't see anything in the water. We yelled for the man, trying to get him to communicate with us so we could save him, but there was no response. About 10 minutes after the man fell off the boat, the lights came back on. Not only that, but the engine also started working again, and so did our radio. We used the spotlights to search in the water, but we were still unable to find the man. There were no other boats, no buoys, and the man was nowhere to be seen. We drove the boat back to shore, and when we inspected it, there was no indication we'd hit anything at all. I really can't explain what happened that night. I can't even begin to speculate on what it was. I do know, though, that it was the scariest experience of my life. I don't really know if the people who read this story will find it particularly scary, but it was pretty terrifying when it happened. I guess all I can ask is that you use your imagination and try to imagine what it would be like if this happened to you on a boat in the middle of an ocean. I have a decent-sized boat, not particularly large, actually more of a small fishing vessel. I never used it for that though. I basically only bought it because it was cheap and served my purposes. My purposes being that I wanted to be able to spend time on the ocean with my wife. My wife and I were out one evening and decided to stay out after dark. This was in the Atlantic Ocean. Normally, we didn't do this very often, but the sunset was beautiful that evening, filling the sky with the most beautiful shades of pink I had ever seen. Once the sun had set, the moon was also beautiful. There was just something about sitting on a boat in the middle of the water, watching the sky at night. Absolutely mesmerizing. After quite a bit of time had passed by, we finally decided that we didn't feel like actually sleeping in the boat that night. We could have, but as much as I like being out on the ocean, I don't really like sleeping in a rocking boat. I always wake up with a real stiff neck. I just don't enjoy it. I mean, who would really? As I was getting ready to leave though, there was this loud thud and the boat tilted hard in one direction. Our boat was pretty sturdy, and it would have to take a massive hit in order to get shaken so hard. My wife, understandably alarmed, ran over to me and asked what had happened. I told her I had absolutely no idea. It would be a good idea for us to get on our way in case it happened again, though. Immediately, it did. There was another loud thud, and our boat rocked once again. I looked at my wife, and I could tell she was terrified. I was too, but I tried my best not to let it show. The force of these impacts were making me very concerned. Whatever was hitting our boat was hitting it real hard, and that meant it had enough strength to knock a hole in our boat and sink it if we let this go on. Yeah, we had a dinghy, but what good would a dinghy be when some underwater force was capable of knocking our much larger fishing boat over? I got the boat started, and we began on our way back. We hadn't been moving for more than 5 minutes when it happened again a third time. Whatever had been hitting us when we were sitting still was now following us, continuing to hit our boat at full force. My wife had tears in her eyes. We were both terrified. After the next hit, we were convinced whatever was doing this was not going to give up. I tried going faster, as fast as I could possibly force the small boat to go. I wasn't sure how much good it would do, though. I was worried the momentum of the boat would help those hits from down under cause even more damage. I was scared of the possibility of the speed causing the ship to capsize. To this day, I'm not even sure if this was a real possibility or not, but to an anxiety-riddled mind, it was something I had to think about. By the time we were slammed into for a 6th time, we were both convinced we were going to die that night out there on the ocean. With the sheer force of the hits, we were surprised the boat hadn't sprung a leak yet. Thankfully, it held together. We braced ourselves for another. When 5 minutes passed without another hit, then 10, then half an hour, we stopped. Although we were relieved it had stopped, we didn't relax at all. We remained tense and scared. I didn't even want to look into the water at any point to see what could be causing it. I was scared as to what I might see. The seventh hit never came. We either outran whatever was hitting us, or it just lost interest. We didn't feel safe until we were on dry land, and it was a very long time before we took the boat out again. A lot of our friends don't believe the story. They think we're trying to create a real-life Moby Dick or something. But hey, the ocean is a huge place. The Pacific Ocean alone is larger than the entire land surface of the world. The sheer volume of water and the very fact that life began in the water tells us a few things. There are some very old things in the ocean, and many things we haven't even the slightest idea about. These things have many places to hide out there. I think the scariest thing about the ocean is how much happens out there without you ever knowing and without consequence. That might not make too much sense, but it will after you hear this story of what happened to me. I was out in my boat with a couple of friends, Joe, Wendy, and Tom. We were having a really good day, just enjoying the water. I don't want to give out the location because the situation was way too disturbing, but we had gone pretty far out there. Normally, we wouldn't stay out too long after dark, but we were having such a good time drinking, telling stories, and the sky was so clear and beautiful that we decided to stay a bit longer. If you've never seen the clear sky at night out on the ocean, then I hope you get the chance to sometime. We were up on deck when a sudden flash of light caught our eye. Tom went over to the side of the boat and shined one of the lights in the direction of that flash. When he did, we saw something that really surprised us. There was a much smaller boat out there in the middle of the darkness, and I mean, this was a really small boat. Sort of like a personal motorboat, not the one you would ever expect people to be using except in more shallow water. It was quite a surprise. It seemed to be floating right in our direction, caught adrift. We tried to make contact with the boat. We figured it was unlikely they were using radio, so we used our sound signal to blast 5 short and very quick blasts of sound toward them. The signal tells the other boat that you don't really know what their intent is. I mean, we didn't think they were up to anything bad really, but it was weird to see such a tiny boat that far out and apparently adrift. There was no response at all. We debated about what we should do. Wendy suggested we should just leave it, because whoever it was must have been up to something shady. Tom and I didn't really think that would be the right choice, though. Joe wanted to approach the boat, and although I was a bit nervous about the idea, I told him that as long as we kept our distance, we could try and get a closer look at what was going on. We slowly started to approach the tiny boat. We shone our lights, but we were still not getting any sort of response. Even a small motorboat colliding with a much bigger boat like ours could still cause damage, so we had to be very careful approaching. I preferred to get close to it before possibly grabbing it with a beam if needed. I can't tell you the right words to explain how creepy it was in the dark, watching this small boat just slowly coming towards us in the water. We watched as it bobbed up and down with the waves, just a shadow on the vast ocean. We pulled up as close as we were comfortable with. I called out, asking if anyone was in need of assistance. There was no answer, but there was clearly something sitting at the wheel. We told the driver we were going to shine our light over there. This was a precaution so we didn't blind the man. He didn't answer, so we went ahead and did so. As we did, though, I realized there was no way the lights could have hurt his eyes in the first place. He didn't have any. All this man had were 2 empty sockets coated with dry and crusty blood. The man was obviously dead. My friends wanted to leave and get the hell out of there as quickly as possible, but I didn't feel right leaving a dead guy out in the middle of the ocean that way. We carefully pulled the boat close to us, and I called the Coast Guard. It took a while, but they came out and got the boat and took us in for some questioning. They were fine with us, not accusing us or anything, but also not telling us much of what they thought either. To this day, I don't know any details of who that man was or what happened to him to make him like that. Honestly, I'm happy I don't. I don't really need to know. I remember the looks of those 2 empty eye sockets as that dead man floated on his boat out on the ocean, a lifeless and directionless captain on a dead vessel. I don't ever need to know anything else about him. I don't think I could handle it. This happened about 5 or 6 years ago. I believe I was around 18 at the time. For starters, I lived in a city where neighborhoods and forests kind of blend together. There are plenty of wooded areas where people go to have bonfires and parties and that sorts of thing. One night, after discovering that all of our usual spots were already crowded with people, I suggested we go to a spot I had been to a few times nearby. I had in fact been there several times, but only ever during the day. The street where we parked was about 200 feet away from the tree line. It was your average middle-class neighborhood. Nothing crazy was really known to happen there. So we walk over, start a bonfire, and we're all having a really good time. Some of us are drinking and smoking a bit, myself included. About 45 minutes passed by, and I was now a little bit intoxicated. Not anything major though. Over the sound of our quiet music and my friends talking, I began to make out an odd sound. I couldn't quite tell what it was at first, so I wrote it off as just hearing things initially. After maybe another 10 minutes went by though, I began to hear it again, a little bit louder this time. It still sounded relatively far away, but it sounded almost like Velcro tearing or something. I stopped and just kind of sat there, trying to listen to what was going on, while my friends were oblivious and carried away laughing and talking. They hadn't seemed to have noticed yet. That's when I heard it clearer, a sound I was very familiar with. A zapping noise, like the kind you'd hear from a taser. It was very brief but unmistakable. My stomach dropped, and I began to look around a little frantically. My girlfriend at the time was the first to notice my distress. She asked me what was wrong, and I explained what just happened. She immediately started worrying as well. She got my friends to quiet down as best she could, and we all sat there in silence, listening out for any noise. Then we all heard it, an electric zap, brief again, but we all recognized the sound. We started panicking a bit. We quickly put out the fire while asking each other what the fuck that was, or where it was coming from. We were all too scared to walk out. It was only a 5-minute walk to the street, but it was through pitch black darkness. With all of us collectively, we mustered up the courage to finally walk the path out, and we didn't run into anyone on our way there. We finally got to the street and began to walk towards our cars, nervously laughing and relishing in being under the street lamps once again. That was when we saw him. I saw him first. A man walking in the darkness towards us, not at us, just kind of walking in the direction we'd just come from, slightly to the right of us. He appeared to be holding some sort of stick of some sort. The man's appearance obviously scared me at first, but after a brief second I calmed myself down. It was a pretty safe neighborhood that I knew really well, and it was common to see people out walking at night. Then though, I noticed he was staring right at us. His stare burned itself into my mind. We passed each other by. My friends and I were all silent, as we were having a stare down with this random man. Not even breaking eye contact, as soon as we passed him by, he held up the pole in his hands and smiled this huge creepy smile. His eyes opened so wide they almost bulged out of his head. The end of the stick lit up a bright light, and that same zapping sound happened once again, much louder this time. The man was holding a cattle prod. We live in a city with no farmland nearby. There was no reason to have a thing like that on him. My friends and I were silently shitting ourselves as he began to follow behind us about 20 feet away. When we got to our cars, he ran into the woods without a flashlight or anything. We all hopped in and peeled the fuck out of there. We never went back to that spot again. Now this is something I really want to talk about to be sure that everyone is cautious and stays level-headed at all times. For some context, I live in the middle of nowhere in Canada, an old town that had quite a few abandoned buildings due to an absence of residents. Me and my many friends were tired of the lack of entertainment options for us, so what we decided to do was explore these abandoned buildings. Prior to the experience I'm about to talk about, nothing had ever happened that was crazy to us. Occasionally, we'd see a small bit of blood-like liquid or other bodily fluids, or see a pentagram spray painted on the ground from someone who went to a house previously, but nothing too crazy. Until the last time I went to explore. When I was younger, I used to go to a daycare that was part mental hospital. Weird combination, I know. It closed down due to a lack of patients and a lack of children at the daycare. Big surprise, I guess. I decided to go back there with my friends to explore. For context, I was 15 when this happened, and most of my friends were the same age. When we got there, it was rather cliché. There was fog, and it was rather dark. There was also a light drizzle of rain. We went to the main gate, which had been padlocked shut. We decided to help each other hop over it, and made a ton of noise in the process. We were all laughing and giggling the whole time, unsuspecting of what was to come. We looked around at the small play place and park with flashlights we had on our person. Even with our somewhat powerful lights, the visibility was rather limited. We decided to actually enter the building itself. Glass and dirt crunched under our feet as we stepped into the daycare section of the complex. There were still old Legos and wood chips from previous furniture, old torn dolls and toys strewn about. The further we walked around the daycare section, we naturally became more and more silent, until all we could hear was the crunch of the dirt under our feet. I found some crayons in a plastic container in the corner of the room. I walked over to observe them, when all of a sudden, we heard a loud crash coming from behind a metal door leading to the psych ward part of the building. My friends and I nervously glanced at each other. As a whole, we were a group of 5. Most of us were very bold and cocky. As we shared our glances, my friend Brian suggested we go and check to see what the sound had come from. Personally, I was not too fond of the idea, but with my group of friends, there was no way anyone was going to decline such a thing. We all stacked up against the door and opened it slowly. It was rusted to the floor, and we had to heave hard to get it to open. As we walked in, the metallic smell and must became stronger, with a hint of something else which I couldn't quite put my finger on at the moment. We walked in, our flashlights pointed in every direction, with Brian leading the group. The hallways were tight. To the left and right were the occasional metal doorway, some with the doors wide open. I felt slightly claustrophobic, and it felt a little bit hard to breathe. As we continued, Brian shone his flashlight into a room and recoiled. We all stopped walking as Brian slowly entered the room. "What's wrong?" I asked him. "Oh, I thought I saw someone here, but it seems it's all fine now." To be honest, I thought he was just messing with us to increase our anxiety, but looking back, I think he was completely honest. He backed out of the room to join us again, and we continued walking deeper into the psych ward. That is, until another friend suddenly told us to stop. We came to a halt and began to listen. In the distance ahead of us in the darkness, we could hear the subtle pitter-patter of footsteps echoing down the hallway. We each looked at each other, fear in our eyes. Brian continued walking toward the sounds. We considered turning back for a moment without him, wondering if some ghost or something was in the building. But of course, we wouldn't do that to him. The closer we got to the sounds, the more I felt like I was being watched. When we finally entered a room on the right, there was a smell of rotting meat. In front of us was a dead deer. Its innards were spilled all over the floor, staining the concrete. A friend of mine had a very weak stomach and vomited all over the floor. At that moment, we began to hear whispering. Brian shone his flashlight to the corner of the room, where a man with short hair was standing with his head facing down. He wore a bright green t-shirt, stained with what I assume was blood. He didn't have any socks on, and his feet appeared quite badly damaged. He was twitching sporadically and continued to mumble even after we saw him. We stared at him for a solid 30 seconds before he made his first true movement. The man looked up at us with vacant eyes and a haunting grin that sent shivers down my spine. "Are you guys here for the feast?" He said each word with a varying inflection and energy. This kicked us over the edge, and we bolted out of the room all the way back to the daycare center. The door was still open. We decided to try and slam it shut, but the rust and weight of the door kept it open. It took 3 of us pulling with all our strength to close it behind us. Just before we did, we could see the silhouette of the man in the darkness watching us, his white teeth being the only feature we could see. We sat behind the metal door, catching our breath for a moment, all looking at each other for confirmation we really just saw that. After a little bit of labored breathing from each of us, we heard a light tapping on the other side of the door. That's when we decided it was time to leave. We booked it out of the complex and ran home. A year after we visited that spot, police were doing a routine search of the area and stumbled upon the man. It was stated that this guy used to go to the psych ward before it closed down. He had been transferred to another place, and when let out, he went back and lived off the wildlife around the complex for a while. When the cops brought him in, he had a series of diseases and sicknesses from eating raw meat, and his mental condition was much worse than before. There were of course rumors that he'd killed someone in the forest while searching for food and eaten them, but nothing like that had ever been confirmed. I guess the guy couldn't let go of his old habits. This story happened to me a while back when I still lived at my parents' home. I was commuting to college at the time and had 3 siblings that also lived there with me, a brother and 2 sisters. For some context, we lived on 5 acres in rural Ohio, surrounded on both sides by woods and farm fields. Additionally, during the week, my dad normally left for work at 2 a.m. I had always felt like it was my job to be the man of the house, because he was gone during the times when you would imagine something sketchy happening. On this night, because it was the weekend, my dad was home, however. In the middle of the night, I was woken up to the sound of my brother's voice trying to grab my attention. We had separate rooms upstairs, and coming out of our rooms, you could look down over the banister and see all the way to our front door. When I woke up, it took a few moments to get out of the haze and realize what was going on. I looked at the clock and noticed it was around 2:30 a.m. or so. My brother told me there were 2 men at our front door. This really woke me up. We quietly walked out of my room and peeked over to look down at the area. When we looked, there was no one at the door, but I did notice my parents off to the side, just out of view of the glass on the front door. I whispered down to my dad to ask what was happening. He told me there were 2 men who had been standing there talking to each other in front of our door and knocking continuously. Hearing my dad say this freaked me out even more. I went back to my room and grabbed my pistol, quickly shuffling down the stairs after looking to make sure they weren't at the door once more. If they had been, they would have easily seen me coming down the stairs, as it was in direct view. My brother was right behind me as we headed over to where my parents were, whispering to try and find out what was going on. Apparently, my parents had awoken to the sound of our dog barking and come out to find these 2 strange men knocking loudly at the door over and over. At this point, the men returned and began to knock again, despite the fact that no one had come to the door and our dog was still actively barking. The fact that they were here at this time, in a location where houses were spread out over hundreds of yards and still knocking, made the situation even more terrifying. After a couple of minutes of knocking, the men walked away. We all shuffled across the kitchen into the family room to peek out the windows into our driveway. We could see there was a black Cadillac just sitting there, but no one was inside from what we could see, and no one seemed to be in the immediate area either. Immediately, the question was, well, where did those guys go then? They weren't in their car, and they were no longer at the front door either. Unfortunately, we figured out the answer when the handles on our back French door started to jiggle wildly. They were actively trying to enter the back of our home, which entered directly into the kitchen. At this point, I remember my mom frantically calling my dad's name as pure terror overwhelmed her. Then, 2 things happened. Adrenaline filled my body as I prepared my handgun, horrified at the very real possibility I may have to shoot someone tonight. And secondly, my dad grabbed the phone, called the police, and very calmly told them what was happening. After a minute of jiggling, they stopped with the back door and disappeared once again, only to return to knocking at the front door later. At this point, several minutes had gone by. Suddenly, we saw the local police fly up in multiple cruisers, all with their lights on. As they whipped into our driveway and front yard, the two men bolted away, attempting to run the long way around the house across the driveway. One of them disappeared out of our view, but the other one was intercepted by an officer, now yelling at him to get on the ground. He didn't and tried to run still, and was immediately tased. He fell flat on his face. Some of the officers went around the house after the other man. One of them came to talk to my dad, and I came out the front as well. They actually ended up finding the other guy hiding in my sister's playhouse in the backyard. It appears both of them were drunk or high or something, as the one who hid had cocaine on him. They were both arrested that night, but we did never figure out what they were charged with, or what happened with them. We weren't sure why they were there either. Needless to say, though, the whole experience was not fun. When I was around 10 or so, my parents and I went to visit my grandmother for spring break. My cousin also came to visit as well, and we decided we wanted to go to the YMCA for the day. My grandmother dropped us off and said she would come and pick us up in 4 hours. On that day, the YMCA was empty. There were a couple of adults in the exercise room, but that's about it. We went to the basketball court, and after 2 hours of playing tag and shooting baskets, we were quite bored. I've never been the biggest fan of swimming, but this YMCA had a pretty cool pool area. We changed into our bathing suits and headed in there. The pool was completely empty, all except for the lifeguard. We played a bunch of games and swam some laps, but after an hour, there wasn't much left to do yet again. There was no one except us to hang out with to keep things interesting either. We decided to play a bit of a game, seeing how long we could hold our breath underwater. We stood in the shallow end near the clock on the wall so we could time ourselves. Instead of fully submerging, we'd just stick our heads face down in the water a bit. We did this a couple of times and I ended up winning. On our very last round, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I figured it was my cousin giving up and telling me I'd won. Instead, it was the lifeguard, who told me to knock it off, or she was going to have to ask us to leave the pool. Since we were tired of being in there anyway, we figured we'd just get out. We'd get dressed, go back to the basketball court until our grandmother picked us up, and just wait there. We only had an hour left anyways, and the water was freezing by this point. As we got out, the lifeguard stopped us and asked us if we wanted to go into the sauna to warm up and dry off. The sign said 18 years or older, so of course we were super excited she allowed us to even do that. She walked us to the sauna and unlocked the door. The door was glass, and the interior was made entirely out of wood. Inside above the door, there was a clock, probably to make sure you were not in there for an unsafe amount of time. The lifeguard stand was adjacent to the sauna, but if you looked out the door you could very clearly see it. She followed us in, went over to the thermometer encased in plastic, and unlocked it so she could crank up the heat. I figured she must have to turn it on each time or something, so I didn't really think much of it. Both my cousin and I were very short girls, so we couldn't actually see the temperature that was printed on the thermometer knob. We knew she was turning up the heat at least. She left and shut the door behind her. I thought I saw her lock the door as well. I thought to myself, though, why would she lock the door when we might want to get out? I checked the clock and decided we should leave in about 10 minutes or so. It was already plenty warm in the sauna, but the room only began to get more blazing. It felt nice at first because I was so cold from the pool. After about 15 minutes, though, it was starting to get a bit too hot. My cousin agreed we should leave so we could get dressed. I went to turn the knob on the door, only to find that it would not budge at all. I thought maybe it had been jammed, so I shook it as hard as I could. It still wouldn't open. I then let my cousin try. She couldn't get it to open either. We figured the lifeguard would be back in a couple of minutes anyway, so we sat back down and waited. The room was getting hotter and hotter, and I really wanted to leave. We got up and started banging on the door for help, shaking and twisting the knob, trying to get the guard's attention. As the room continued to get hotter, we began to scream at the top of our lungs for her to let us out, but she just stared straight ahead, ignoring us. There's no way she wouldn't have noticed or heard us banging and kicking the door and screaming. By now, we had been in there for 25 minutes, It was so hot in the sauna I could barely even breathe. It felt like my lungs were on fire. My skin and eyes were burning. We sat back down and put our towels over our heads. They were at least still a little bit damp and made it easier to breathe. I was worried about my cousin especially. She was a couple of years younger than me, and she was really struggling. I looked at the clock and saw we had been stuck inside for 35 minutes. I got up and walked to the door again. I saw the guard still just staring straight ahead. Again, I tried to get her attention by screaming we needed out right now. I banged on the door as hard as I could, but still nothing. I was starting to get dizzy. I went to sit back down, but the wooden seats were so hot that they burned my skin. The towel was completely dry, so I put it underneath me to cover my skin. My hair was also extremely dry. I wrapped it across my face to cover my nose and squinted my eyes so they wouldn't burn as badly. I tried my best to still watch if anyone walked past the door. It helped me a bit. My cousin was laying down with the towel over her head, not moving or saying anything anymore. I nudged her to make sure she was still okay. I could tell we really needed to get out of here right now. She was extremely disoriented. It had been 45 minutes now, and I was beginning to get nauseous. There was no way the lifeguard had simply forgotten we were in there. I thought she would come back soon, but there was a little voice in my head telling me that she'd purposefully locked us in there. Finally, a man just happened to be walking past the door to the pool. I was too weak to even get up though. My whole body was on fire. I was too dizzy to stand. Luckily, the man wasn't going to the pool. He wanted to be let into the sauna and came back with the lifeguard. I saw them walking this way and immediately jumped up to grab my cousin. I knew now for sure she had locked us in there because as she neared the door, she pulled out her keys to unlock it and let the man in. I didn't want to take any chances of us being trapped in there any longer. As the man was trying to walk in, I was desperately trying to shove our way out. As we were trying to escape, the lifeguard began to shut the door and try to push me back inside. The man was clearly confused about what was going on. "Hey, what are you doing? I think they want to get out." The lifeguard let out a huge sigh and opened the door fully. I grabbed my cousin and ran as fast as I could to the changing room. We only had about 10 minutes before grandmother was supposed to pick us up. We were both so shaken by what just happened that we didn't say anything to each other as we got dressed or on the car ride home. When we got back to the house, my parents were making us dinner, and I told them the story of what happened. They thought I must have been exaggerating and told me they didn't believe me. I truly believed that woman was going to let us cook alive in there. The only bit of doubt I have is what would have happened if we'd actually died. She obviously would have gotten the blame, so what was her endgame? I'm 21 now, but I still think about this interaction all the time. When I'm in small spaces or I get too warm, I still have panic attacks. No one I tell ever believes this story. I mean, I get it, it's pretty absurd, I know. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to ask for opinions or whatnot, but what do you think this could have been? Some crazy misunderstanding? Or do you think she really wanted us to die? If so, why? Hello, you can call me Evie. I wanted to tell my story because it was absolutely terrifying at the time it happened. It all started on the morning of February 14th, 2018. I was in middle school at the time, and the campus was buzzing with life. Guys were running around with gifts for their girlfriends, girlfriends were handing out gifts to their boyfriends, and friends were exchanging candies. All in all, everything was fairly normal. Now, I wasn't popular per se, but I knew everyone and everyone sort of knew me. I preferred to hang around with a small group of close friends though, because being around too many people made me very anxious. During lunch, I was hanging around with my usual group of friends, which consisted of 2 girls, Alex and Mia, and 3 guys, Nico, Adrian, and Elijah. Valentine's Day of all days made me even more anxious. A lot of people would try to join our group because my friend Adrian attracted a lot of girls. My friend Mia was also very attractive and a sweetheart as well, so a lot of guys would come over for her. I began to feel a bit overwhelmed by all these people, so I slipped out of my group and headed to my secret hiding place. Really though, it was just a bench that was sort of out of the way in a field hidden by some trees. No one really went out there since it was so far, so it was a good place to kind of recollect and catch my breath. As I was reading through a book I had, I could hear someone getting closer to me. I looked up to see this guy named Emmanuel. When I saw Emmanuel, I instantly started to freak out. He always seemed to have this sort of weird infatuation with me. Every day he would force himself on me, randomly touching me, trying to kiss me, yelling that he liked me in my face. Believe it or not, I would even see him wandering around my neighborhood, and he didn't live anywhere near there. I decided to play it cool and continued reading. All of a sudden, he just grabbed the book right out of my hands. "Hey, what the hell, man? I was reading that," I yelled. He simply responded, "Sorry, I just wanted your attention." I was still angry, but I tried to calm myself down. "Alright, well, what do you want?" "I really like you. I want you to be my girlfriend. I swear I'll treat you like a queen." After he said that, he handed me a box of chocolates and this stuffed bear. Actually, I thought it was quite a nice gesture. I always felt uncomfortable when he was around though, so I told him that even though it was very sweet of him, I was already in a relationship. That was of course not true. The instant the words left my mouth, he turned from being nice to extremely angry. He screamed at me, asking how dare I date someone that was not him. I tried to get up to leave, but he grabbed my arm and shoved me back down and forcefully kissed me, with tongue and all. It was gross. I tried to push him off of me, but he was way stronger than I was. I screamed for help at the top of my lungs, but he quickly covered over my mouth. I bit his hand and kicked him in the balls. He was shocked. I broke free and ran to my friend group. He yelled behind me, screaming out how he would rape me and kill me. Obviously, the on-duty guards heard this and immediately took action. I just wanted to get to the safety of my group though, so I kept running until I bumped into Adrian. I grabbed a hold of him and cried my eyes out. He comforted me until I was ready to talk to him. I told him everything that happened when I was called into the principal's office. They had me explain everything, and the police were called right away. It was a really long day, and I just wanted to go home. After I told them what happened, I was allowed to leave for home early. I later found out that in his house he had built a shrine for me, with pictures of me doing various things. Walking my dog, eating in the living room with my family. He'd even taken photos of me changing. It was horrible and traumatizing, so I hope I never have to meet him again. So I want to get this out of the way right now. I live in Michigan and not exactly in the nicest area either. There have been multiple occasions which have been caught on video of people either trying to steal my mom's car, 2 generators, or break into the house entirely. It's gone far enough for someone to break into our sunroom before our family's dog scared them off. Now, how is this relevant to the story, you might ask? Well, we recently moved the camera with the motion lights on it to the front fence to watch the cars. It had previously been hooked up on the garage to get a view of the back. The reason for moving it was because we had a small driveway and could only park 1 car in without things being cramped. The garage itself had 2 motorcycles as well. One was my brother's and one my stepfather's. Because of all this concentrated value, I'd had encounters with these people trying to break in before. I even caught them in the car one time and have caught them 3 times in the backyard. Now we get to the actual relevance of this whole post. 2 nights ago, I was taking the garbage out. It was around 10 to 10:30 p.m. I wanted to do it before I got on the game, because I knew I'd forget if I didn't. I tossed everything in the bin. There was considerable space between our 3 garbage cans, and after I tossed them in the first one, I heard something scurrying off. Without our motion light on, I couldn't exactly tell what it was, since it was pitch black outside. I wasn't too scared though. One of our bins had a big hole in it, and because of that, we'd get raccoons coming around all the time. I figured I'd just scared off one of those little guys. Later in the night, around 1:30 a.m., I decided to hang around with my brother for a bit. We went riding around town on the motorcycle and got back about 15 minutes later. He pulled into the driveway, and since we as of now were running off a generator which couldn't power the garage, he told me we'd need to pull the garage hood manually while he backed his work truck up. I began to open it, and he was backing up. The red lights of his truck lit up the backyard a bit. As he was backing up, I began to hear something scurrying around the side of the house again. I quickly turned on my phone flashlight, since this time I actually had it on me. My brother asked me what was wrong. "Oh, nothing. It's probably just a raccoon in the trash." I turned my light on, and boom. There was this, I don't know how to describe it. There was a man, and he was on all fours, just waiting in the darkness next to our house. That's all I could see before I screamed and started bolting the other way. Now, I have no idea what he was doing there like that, but this guy was massive. My brother was 200 pounds, and he was bigger than him even. Big enough that he'd broken the hinge on our fence. I didn't actually see him do this since it was down the street, but the fence had a padlock. The part that made me the most confused is that after I took off running, I went to investigate the next morning. I looked, and there were no tracks or any evidence of the person around. I wanted to post this to see if anyone might have some help as to what I should do. Anyway, it's 3:49 in the morning, and remembering it has me terrified. I must have told this story over 100 times, and despite being the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me, I've come to appreciate that it makes for a great story. I figured because of this, I'd share it with you all. I should start by saying that I always hated going camping. My parents sent me to summer camp every year in Colorado, which involved at least one camping trip into the woods. Despite the brevity of these trips, I always resented them. The heavy bag, the lack of toilets, the spiders that always found their way into my tent. When I turned 16 and became a camp counselor in training, however, my distaste for the whole experience briefly changed. At that age, we were only a few years older than the oldest campers, but we were given considerable leeway in what we were allowed to do. Most nights we would have to stay in the cabin with our campers, but it was rumored that the camping trip was a time where the counselors in training would get drunk, smoke weed, and hook up with each other after everyone else went to sleep. What I did not know at the time, however, was that the events of this camping trip would dissuade me from ever going camping again. The trip began as any other might. Altogether, there were 30 people on the trip. 4 counselors in training, 4 real counselors, and around 20 or so boys and girls between the ages of 13 and 14, walking in a single file line up and down various trails. You could barely hear the sounds of nature over the conversations and laughter of the campers. Several hours went by, and we made our way through a dense marshy area and up a steep incline populated with evergreens and aspens. I was not the most athletic person, so it was at around this point that I found myself stumbling to the back of the line with one of the other counselors in training, Jordan, as well as 2 other campers who were really struggling to keep up. The 4 of us started chatting, and in our distracted state, we began to fall more and more behind the rest of the campers. Eventually, the last of them faded out of view around a bend about 50 feet up the way. Unconcerned, we kept walking at the same slow pace, but after 30 minutes or so, the trail started to level off, and I began to feel increasingly anxious. Not only had the rest of the group completely disappeared ahead of us, but we had entered a stretch of completely dead evergreens, half of which looked scorched by a wildfire, and the other half which appeared to have been killed by a disease of some sort. The eeriness of this landscape was punctuated by a small derelict cabin sitting in the middle of this scorched forest. It was seemingly untouched by the fire that had spread through the area. We were so enraptured by this scene that one of the campers screamed when a twig broke behind us. Jordan and I started laughing a bit, but we quickly stopped when we turned around to look at where the sound had come from. Not 20 feet behind us, there was a haggard-looking man with a messy nest of black hair and a big, thick beard. He was slowly making his way up the trail, with his eyes locked to us. He didn't appear to have any supplies on him, and we had no idea how long he'd been walking behind us. Being young, we were naturally freaked out. Jordan managed to give the guy a wave before saying to the rest of us, "Come on, let's go and get back with the rest of the group." As we turned to continue our way up the path, the man mumbled a question that was hard to hear. I was shocked when Jordan turned around to ask the man to repeat himself. "Going camping?" Jordan answered the man. "Yeah, we're going with a group." The man smiled before stating in a creepy and ominous voice, "Well, you better be careful." We nodded and gave a half-hearted thank you before continuing on to try and find the rest of the group, this time at a much faster pace. Although the man had been walking up the same trail as us when we saw him, he didn't continue. He stood there in the center, watching us as we made our way up the winding path, and eventually disappeared from his view. Finally, we managed to catch up with the rest of the group. They had all been waiting up ahead for us. We told the adult counselors about our interaction with the man. They just shrugged it off, telling us the guy probably lived in that cabin and wanted to know what we were doing on his property. Still, I felt unnerved by the encounter, and when we finally arrived at the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had somehow followed us. Eventually, I did put it out of my mind and managed to start enjoying myself a bit. Everyone else had gone to bed at some point, and Jordan and the other counselors in training from the boys' cabin brought 2 warm Mike's Harders that they had stolen from the counselors' quarters. I took out a joint I had stashed away for this exact occasion. To avoid getting into trouble, we hiked out into the woods to smoke the joint together. We made our way to the edge of the river, where we washed our pots and pans earlier in the day. The spot was eerily silent, and suddenly the thought of the man from earlier popped into my head. I guess they assumed I was cold and not anxious, because Jordan handed me his blue hoodie, and this prompted one of the other girls to suggest we switch tents for the night so I could sleep in the same tent with him, and she could sleep in the same tent as the other boy. I had no problem with this really, and after smoking the joint we made our way back. The tents were pitched slightly away from the others, and we discreetly sipped on the Mike's Harders while telling scary camping stories. Some time passed by. One of the boys was in the middle of telling a rather confused story he was clearly making up on the spot when he suddenly stopped altogether. In the silence, we could hear what sounded like footsteps crunching on pine needles about 40 feet away. It was near one of the other campers' tents. As we strained to focus on what was going on, the noises stopped. We assumed it was just one of the campers getting up to go to the bathroom. Being stoned and hopped up from the scary stories, we decided to call it a night and go hide away in our tents. We awkwardly made it out of there before eventually going to sleep. I don't know what time it was, but it must have been quite late, when I suddenly woke up to the distinct sounds of footsteps walking around my tent. Shot up with adrenaline, I tried to lay as still as possible and quiet my breathing down. From the noises, it was apparent someone was less than 3 feet away from the front of my tent, seemingly pacing back and forth. I turned to wake up Jordan. I felt a bit more relieved when I saw he wasn't next to me. I was assuming Jordan must be the one I was hearing. I closed my eyes, and just as I was beginning to drift back up to sleep, I heard the tent unzip. I felt Jordan lie down next to me, and after a few moments he wrapped his arms around me and began to spoon me. I realized I had to go to the bathroom. I muttered something about having to go before beginning to unzip my sleeping bag. Seemingly annoyed by the noise, Jordan lazily turned over, pulling his hoodie up over his head before going still again. Quietly, as to not wake him, I unzipped the tent and quickly scanned the campsite for any movement. Comforting myself that Jordan had just gone to pee and was fine, I put my shoes on and began making the trek across our campsite to the designated zone. I just made it to the area and pulled my pants down when I heard the rustling coming from the campsite. Someone was rummaging through our supplies and bags. Still slightly drunk, I pulled my pants up and in my haste, lost my balance. I tried to catch myself with a branch that snapped as I grabbed it. I tried to gather myself as quietly as I could, but when I managed to look up, I could see a figure in the darkness making its way across our campsite in my direction. Before I could even think, I was blinded by the bright light of a flashlight shining directly into my eyes. The light was getting bigger, so whoever this was coming right toward me. Frozen and panicked, I watched as the figure came right in front of me, before I heard Jordan's voice call out, "Hey, sorry I scared you, it's just me." I breathed a sigh of relief. Then Jordan asked something that really confused me though. "Hey, have you seen my blue hoodie anywhere? I know you gave it back to me, but I think one of the campers must have stolen it from my bag or something while I was sleeping." After a brief pause, I managed to stutter out, "But you were just wearing it when you got back in the tent." "What are you talking about?" he said. "It's been missing since we got back from the river. I even went down there to see if you had left it by accident, but after I couldn't find it, I went to check the boys' bags, and that's when I saw you." My confusion quickly turned to sheer terror as I realized the person who climbed into the tent with me just moments prior was not Jordan. Sensing that something was wrong, Jordan asked me what happened. I managed to choke out that whoever stole his item was sleeping in our tent. Not believing me, he insisted on walking back to check it out. As slowly and quietly as possible, we made our way to the side of the tent. When Jordan flipped on his flashlight and shined it in through the nylon lining, he let out a high-pitched scream. We could both see the clear outline of a man's shadow lying still inside our tent. What happened next is a bit of a blur. We ran to the pot of tents on the other side of the campground where the older counselors were sleeping. We frantically unzipped their tent and started screaming for help. There was a man in our tent. I remember panic setting in as our counselors slowly and groggily woke up. After a bit of frantic yelling, they managed to understand the severity of the situation. A commotion broke out on the other side of camp near our tent. By the time they ran to the scene, however, they only found an unzipped tent and a bunch of our things littered on the ground. The man had apparently knocked them over or thrown them out during his escape. We heard the counselors radioing back down to the camp to call the police, and we could tell they were just as scared as we were. I don't think any of us got sleep after that. Luckily, we only had to wait a few hours for the sun to come up, and by that time, a few other people had arrived with guns to escort us back to camp. On our way back down, one of the campers found Jordan's jacket tied around one of the trees on the path, like some kind of marker. Needless to say, he didn't want it back, and we just left it there. To this day, I can't say for certain that the man in the tent was the same guy we ran into earlier on the trail, but his face and that night still haunt me. When I was younger and just got into online college, I got my first apartment. I had 3 jobs and one was third shift. I was more than ready for independence. While I had a great time there, I did have one problem: my new downstairs neighbor. So, the other tenants were a bit older than I am, with one of them even being an old man who'd lived there for 20 years. The other was a middle-aged woman with a small kid, probably been there for 3 or 4 years. Then there was an empty apartment downstairs. I kept to myself and never really spoke to any of them, before I noticed that there had been a new move-in, a man that seemed closer to my age, perhaps a tiny bit older. He had black greasy hair and was a little bit overweight, but my experience living here with people seemed very nice. I was happy to have another neighbor to say hello to. That possibility turned sour quite quickly. I said a casual hello, which turned into "that trash stinks" remarks from him when I was taking out the trash, and snide remarks under his breath when I'd done nothing wrong. He even remarked on my sister's lack of a bra when she came to visit me. Naturally, I was annoyed that he had to comment on anyone and everything, especially on my sister. I told the landlord about him, but nothing came of it, of course. One day when I was asleep, someone came banging on my door. I had no idea who it could be. I was alone, and I never expected a knock that wasn't planned. It was that annoying neighbor saying I was being too loud and I needed to stop harassing him. I explained through the door that I was asleep and was not making any noise at all. He stomped down the stairs, all while screaming that I was a dumb bitch. My heart felt like it was beating out of my chest. I went back to bed, only to hear him stomp back up the stairs and start slamming on my door. When I asked him what was wrong with him, he kept saying I was harassing him. He was calling the cops because I was making too much noise. There was no way I could possibly be making any noise loud enough for him to hear. He was on the other side of the building. He stormed off, cursing and calling me a bitch yet again. I told the landlord that he was now becoming hostile, that I didn't feel comfortable with him around. He told me he would look into it, and I didn't hear anything again for a week. It turned out it was his neighbor hitting the floor with a stick because the rude neighbor next to them was playing their music too loud or something. He should have known that, as I was on the complete other side, but it was like he just wanted an excuse to come bother me. The following months, it got even worse. One day, I walked out in a snowsuit so I could play around in the snow. He made fun of me about how unnecessary it was. There was 3 feet of snow out. I forgot what I said in response. Something like it was not any of his business. He said fuck you and told me he was gonna kill me. I walked off to go play in the snow. At least that gave me a bit of enjoyment after our earlier interaction. I went back home to get ready for work. The snow got even worse, and I had just come back from my night shift. I saw him sitting alone in the parking lot, with his car on and all the windows up. I was on high alert. I walked around and up the alley to my apartment. The second I closed the door to the upstairs, I heard loud wall-shaking music begin blasting. Of course, he was doing this at 3 a.m. I was surprised and confused what his reasoning could possibly be, especially since he'd been bothering me about harassing him before. He blasted this until 8 o'clock in the morning. Soon it started getting more serious, confronting me in the hallway, constantly blasting huge loud music at me. The police knocking at our doors asking us about the noise disturbances. There was now a mutual hatred amongst all the other neighbors at this asshole who kept acting up. Another time, I'd just gotten back from my night shift and it was 3 a.m. yet again. I was dragging my tired feet over to the mailboxes that were right inside the townhouse door. As I'm searching through my ads and letters, his door opens at the top of the stairs. My stomach tightened, hoping I wouldn't have to interact with him. I began to feel very unsettled when he started speaking to me, but all his words were coming out unintelligibly. He began gurgling and mumbling something to himself. He kept repeating these weird sounds and appeared to be getting more aggressive. I felt something was really wrong here. I started to swiftly walk around and out the door, heading back to my car. I thought I'd rather sleep in my car than be attacked in the hallway in front of my apartment. Just as I was having the thought, I heard the window above slam open. I froze and stopped just before the edge of the corner so I was still out of sight. He was staring out his window, seemingly searching all over for me. I stood there for a moment, watching him. He was yelling insane gibberish. I thought to myself it was my chance to sneak upstairs. If he was looking out the window, he wouldn't see me pass by his door and into my place. I sped up the stairs and passed his door to the second flight. Right as I reached the top, his door swung open with a big slam. I heard that he'd begun to follow behind me. My heart was beating out of my ribcage. I was walking, fishing my keys out of my bag. Like a classic horror movie, I kept fumbling looking for the correct one. The hallway was completely dark, and I could hear him right behind me. Mentally, I told myself not to panic. I spotted the correct key and slid it into the keyhole on the first go. I swung the door open and launched myself inside before slamming it shut behind me. I paused and held my breath. I could hear him standing against my door, muttering gibberish into it and calling me all sorts of names. I heard him stumble back downstairs and out the building. I watched him through a crack in my window blind, pacing back and forth, muttering, cursing, and at one point screaming, before walking off into the night. A little bit of relief as I headed to bed, hoping he wouldn't come back to bother me. The next day, I got a text from the landlord. He said the guy was arrested and wouldn't be coming back. Seems he was off his meds again or something. Of course, I raised an eyebrow to that comment. Now, you tell me? I followed a link my landlord had sent me, which showed a mugshot and a description of his nightly activity, including stealing, threatening cops to shoot them, and even punching one of them. I never did see him again, just his family coming in and moving his stuff out. That was a pretty scary time for me. This story takes place in a very small town in the northeast region of the United States. It was in the summer before I went off to college in 2015. After I graduated from high school, my parents decided to move to a smaller, more affordable house about 45 minutes north into the mountains. We stayed in my childhood home because the public schools in my area were the best in my state. My parents really valued my education. I ended up going off to an amazing university, and now I have an incredible career because of that education. As most people in the US know, however, amazing public education usually comes with higher property taxes. My parents got to the point where they could not afford the taxes on their 4,000 square foot home anymore, and decided to sell it just after I graduated from high school. Their home is humble and sits on a beautiful piece of land in the side of a beautiful mountain. And the trees are always so green, and there's a lot of wildlife around. They don't really have any neighbors either, as their driveway is 1.5 miles long. That's the place they chose to live in after I went to college, though. In August of 2015, we moved into this new house. I wasn't planning on staying long, as I was getting ready to head off as a freshman for the first time. We decided to have a little housewarming party with a bunch of family friends and my best friend at the time as well. My dad was manning the barbecue, my mom was making drinks, and we were playing with our dogs. It was a grand time, and everyone was having extreme amounts of fun. My dad had built a brick fire pit in our backyard as well. Just to set the scene for you here, the fire pit was about 30 feet from our back patio door, and we had a picnic table and other seats all around. Behind the seating was the tree line. It was so dark sometimes at night, you needed a flashlight to even see 10 feet in front of you. With the fire pit lit, you couldn't see someone unless they were either sitting next to you or across from you in front of the pit. My best friend decided to stay the night, and we asked my dad if we could make some s'mores. It was getting a little chilly, as it tends to do in the late summer in the northeast at night. My parents left us outside with my dog Nino. He was a loyal, incredible dog that my dad trained as his right hand. He was our protector, as he could run extremely fast, was very strong, and alerted us whenever something went bump in the night. Nino was laying in between us facing the tree line, and my best friend was to my right. Our backs were to the dark, dense tree line. Our first mistake. We were laughing, joking, and eating s'mores together, planning for our future, and generally excited about going off to college together. She decided to play some music, and we relaxed there with one another, feeling content and at ease. It was the perfect summer night, really, until Nino suddenly started growling. I saw his ears perk up, and his head cocked to the side. He sat up and continued to growl. My best friend and I looked at each other, thinking Nino must have seen a stray animal or something not that threatening. This area was known for lots of deer, maybe rarely a coyote or wolf. Since he was trained to help my dad hunt, we assumed it must be a buck or a fawn in the distance behind us. We went back to singing along to the music playing and talking about our fall 2015 class schedule. Again, Nino started growling. Our second mistake, we didn't call for my dad. We didn't even think there was a problem until Nino started getting much more loud and vicious. He stood bolt upright and started barking as if alerting us to activity beyond the tree line that we could just barely not see. We stood up as well, the fire obscuring our view. My best friend took her phone, paused the music, and switched on her flashlight. She started to walk toward the edge of the tree line, with Nino by her side going crazy. He was alerting us not to go any further and to call for help. We stood still in silence, listening. I was too afraid to even breathe at this point. My friend was about to start walking into the woods. When she shined her flashlight, though, it swept across a figure, someone peering out from behind a tree. A man with a green shirt and green pants on, about 5'11". We screamed and ran as fast as we could inside, leaving the fire unattended and this creepy man stuck behind the tree. What we didn't know at the time is where this man had come from. We crashed through our front door, breathless with Nino trailing behind us. It startled my mother, obviously, who was washing dishes and cleaning up. She was talking to my dad about something they'd seen on the news. We cut him off mid-sentence to explain there was a man dressed in all green lurking behind a tree in the woods. We didn't know how long he was there, or if he was still there, but we were both crying. I remember feeling extremely sick, like I was going to throw up. My dad jumped up, grabbed his shotgun and headlamp, and ran outside with Nino. My mom gathered us into the living room, shut all the lights in the house off, and locked the doors. She told us to be quiet, and she was going to call 911. As she did that, my best friend and I shook with fear. We were anticipating gunshots and screaming, but we never heard any. Now, my mom on the phone with 911 described what we saw to the operator. I heard her say "oh" in an alarming way after the dispatcher relayed some information we couldn't hear. At this point, my dad rushed back inside. My mom let him know the police were on their way. Being in a small town on a mountain with less than 10,000 people around means we don't get our own police force. We get the state police every time there's a call made to emergency responders. My dad put his gun away and waited for the police to show up. To our complete bewilderment, they didn't just send one officer like you'd expect, but 10, and an entire SWAT team. A helicopter started to circle the area as well. We were rightfully terrified. I was practically having a panic attack at this point. The officers came inside our home and asked us again what the man was wearing, what he looked like, if we were able to discern any scars or tattoos. We explained the weird matching green outfit and his glasses. The officer excused himself and alerted the SWAT members outside of our description. They started to search the woods behind our home, with guns drawn and the helicopter circling above. They advised us to stay inside, and they would let us know when and if they found something. After about 25 minutes, we got another knock on our door. It was not one but two officers this time. My dad let them in, and they explained the situation. One officer explained that we must have seen on the news that a convicted felon from the prison about 20 miles away had escaped into the mountains. The police had tried to set up a perimeter 10 miles around the prison, but the convict had slipped through somehow. The outfit the man was wearing, as well as our description of him, signaled to them that this was the escaped convict that was lurking through our remote, densely wooded backyard at night. The all-green outfit was the standard issue for prisoners in my state back then. They did not, however, find the man. After 25 minutes of searching, he was still at large. The officers let us know they were going to have a squad car stay and watch our house for a few days. They were unable to locate him and believed he was still an active threat to our safety. That night, we all slept in the living room together. My dad's shotgun was within arm's reach at all times. Later that week, we got another knock on our door from the officers stationed outside. They let us know that the man was back in custody, and we now no longer had to worry. They advised us to install some security cameras and said how sorry they were this all happened to us. After that, my parents spent about $10,000 on cameras and fencing for our backyard. It's now all fenced in, and we have 4 cameras watching the tree line at all times. I guess you never know what will happen, or what goes bump in the night. I currently live in an RV in my mom's driveway. My town is just slightly larger than small, and it's relatively safe. Lots of rich people, doctors, and the like live here, so it's kept very nice and crime is relatively low. I never expected something bad to happen to me because of this, but tonight I met a certain man, and he was a reminder to me to always lock my door. Sometimes I forget, even while I'm sleeping. It's never really been a big deal to me, because my town is generally so safe, but I'll be remembering every time from now on. It was around 2 a.m., and I'd just taken my garbage outside to the bin. When I turned around, I noticed a figure in the dark walking toward me. I started to quickly walk away, but the man called out to me. He was a short person, probably in his 50s or 60s. I'm 23, by the way. He started to talk to me about my RV. I took charge of the conversation and shut it down very quickly. He randomly told me what house he lived in, and his name as well. He was very polite, but he was giving a very off vibe. I'm sure nearly every woman knows what I mean. You know, that older man kind of creepy. Too polite to you just because you're a pretty young girl, that sort of thing. He told me I should come by his house sometime. Yeah, sure, maybe one day. Good night. I walked back to my RV and locked the door right away. I figured he'd just leave, but he didn't. I don't have a curtain on my window right now. I could hear him pacing outside my window and mumbling out loud to himself. I was hiding. I wanted to lock the door by my bed. I mean, it didn't open at all anyway, but I still wanted to lock it regardless. I got up and looked outside, only to see the man staring right in at me. He was waving at me to get my attention, walking right up to my window and acting completely erratic, so different from the way he'd just been acting. I locked the door and he watched me. After that, he left my window. I could feel he was still there though. 5 or so minutes passed by, and now he was knocking at the RV door. I waited there for about an hour before I grabbed a knife and took the chance to sprint to my mom's house. I'm definitely getting a taser or a gun after this. He'd been standing across the street, waiting for me. There's no reason for him to have been just outside my RV that long, at 2 a.m. I think he'd been watching me for a while, too. People shouldn't really know that I lived in that RV. Walking down the street, it's not something you'd initially note. I've only ever started to pay attention to the RVs and driveways since I started living in one. And still I don't notice if people are actually in them or not. I don't know, maybe I'm being naive, but it makes me wonder how long he's been watching me, seeing as how he knew immediately I lived in the RV that day. I don't really ever leave it much except for necessities, since I'm a complete homebody. So he'd have actually had to been watching for a long time to notice someone living in it. It terrifies me. I was afraid of his intentions. He made me realize that even though I live in a safe town, I'm still a young woman, and I'm a target on many men's lists. It sucks that that's the way it is, and it sucks there are people out there who are like this towards other people. This happened to us 2 years ago. We, myself, my daughter, and her father, lived in a shared house. This incident took place over the span of an entire month. So one day we decided to walk to the store, as it was close by to the house and it was quite a nice day out. When we came back though, we noticed someone had tried to pry the locks off our door while we were gone. There were obvious dents and huge blue marks. There was a big boot print on our door as well, both the front and back doors. Someone wanted in real bad. I had no idea why though. We had nothing of major value and lived out in the hood. We had been gone for less than 20 minutes, so of course we were on edge. The person could very well still be around. We heard no sign of them for the rest of that day, but after that, so many bizarre things started to happen. I'm trying my best to explain this in a way that's easy to follow and to keep it short as well. If I listed out each and everything that happened that I'd noticed in my house, I'd be typing for many days. The most common thing was that I'd find things out of place where I know I didn't put them there. I'd notice the locks on my old-ass windows were suddenly broken, or that my dish liquid bottle was broken as well. There was always this weird oily substance on random shit as well. On the curling iron in the bathroom, even on some of my daughter's toys. Later on, I went to take the trash out to the dumpster in the alley. When I lifted up the lid, I saw some type of homemade tool inside. It was a short metal rod with a washcloth tied around the end and a blue doctor's type glove on the other end. I realized this is what the person had been using on my door to try and pry open the lock. That's where the blue markings had come from. Well, holy shit. What else was out here in the trash? I took a look in my neighbor's dumpster as well, just because I had a bit of a suspicion. What I found made my heart sink. In their trash bag were several of my belongings, the most random stuff too. The title to my old car, which had been in a duffel bag in the top of my closet, some of my clothes, some makeup, random household items. At this time, the woman who lived next door saw me discovering this. She and the man who lived there with her started to yell at me quite loudly. She walked out and across the street. The man was just standing in the doorway giving me a death look. I was pissed and scared, coming to the realization that these people had been in my house several times. I looked up at them. "I know you guys have been in my house, you motherfuckers!" The immediate response? "Well, I didn't steal anything," with a smirk. Quick description of the man, a shirtless, fat, redneck old white guy. I was fucking losing it. The words slipped right out of my mouth. "If you do that again, I'm gonna burn your fucking house down." My mind was racing, thinking of all the times I discovered things out of place. My dish liquid bottle that was broken, well, it sat on the sink just below the window. They must have broken it through coming in. They'd been in my house multiple times. Cut to the chase. I called the cops, they came out, talked to the neighbors, and left right away. After they left, the man was out by my back door on the phone with someone with a big grin. Not 10 minutes later, 5 cars pulled up full of people. A big truck pulled up behind mine and blocked it in. A white guy with a tank top on and gold chains around his neck hopped out. He had a gun. I shoved a chair up against my back door and saw these people heading right for it. I screamed for my boyfriend, grabbed my daughter, and ran as fast as I could out the front door. At this time, there were people coming around the side of the house as well. I could hear them start shooting. I was almost off the porch. All I could do was scream for mercy and yell, "Please, no." We were running down the street as I was holding my daughter. Because I was running with her, she had no idea what was going on. I could just feel I was about to get shot in the back. I knew I was going to get gunned down in the street. Somehow, though, we made it around the corner and didn't die. Called the cops again. They searched and found no bullets. Took statements from the neighbors. I asked them to stay for a moment while I went into the house to grab some clothes, as we sure as shit weren't going to stay there tonight. When I went to grab the clothes and diapers, I saw an empty gallon of weed killer in my daughter's room. What the fuck? That must have been the oily substance I'd been coming across. In the time it took us to run, wait on the cops, and come back, they had re-entered my house again and poured weed killer all over my clothes, my daughter's clothes, and all her diapers. I gathered up what I could and left. Nothing ever came of it, of course. No arrests, and the last time I went back was to get the rest of my belongings and never come back again. There will be no answers to all my questions, and I still have nightmares about it. I'll never get closure either. My boyfriend showed me this sub a while back, and after lurking for a hot second, I realized I had my own story to tell. The summer of my junior year in high school, I'd been romantically involved with a guy. We'd gotten to the point in our relationship where he was ready for me to meet his friends. We decided it would be cool if we all went to the state fair that was in town for the next few days. With a little bit of planning and corralling, we all hopped into my boyfriend's little Taurus and headed for the city. Keep in mind, we're all a bunch of dumb, edgy teenagers, so a pre-game hotbox was a must for any event. With the exception of my boyfriend who was driving, we were all pretty damn high. At one point, one of the girls in the car suggested we pull over and get some snacks from the gas station coming up. For whatever reason, I was the one who managed to get stuck with the job of running in and grabbing what everyone wanted. I was annoyed, but pretty desperate for his friends to think I was cool. I jotted down everyone's requests on my phone and headed inside. I walked up and down a few aisles for a bit, trying to find what I could from the list. Around the end of my little shopping spree, I picked up a bag of chocolate-dipped pretzels and turned to head to checkout. That was when an older man in the row behind me called out and asked me to toss him a bag. I, of course, thought nothing of this and figured I'd save him the trip and be nice. I threw one over to him. I took my snacks to the counter, and that was when I noticed the man was now following me. He asked me a few questions, like my name and where I was headed with all that food. I don't know if it was because I was blitzed or just stupid, but I happily answered all his questions, even telling him my real name, and that I was headed to the fair with some friends. He smiled and told me my name was the same as his daughter's name. He seemed polite enough, maybe a bit too chatty and bad with social cues, but otherwise harmless. It was then that he offered to pay for my things, telling me I should save my money for the fare. I shook my head and insisted it was fine, but thanked him for the offer. He slapped his hand hard on my shoulder. It lingered for a bit too long. He whispered and told me not to move, and he'd get his wallet from his truck. I started to feel a bit uneasy then. I exchanged glances with the woman at the counter, and I could tell the weird feeling was mutual. I tried to use him going to his car as a chance to fish out my money, pay for my shit, and get the fuck out of there. I grabbed my receipt and started sprinting towards the car when the man made a beeline right for me in the parking lot. He wagged his finger and scolded me for leaving without waiting. I uncomfortably laughed it off and told him I should be getting back to my friends. They'd been waiting for a long time. It was then that he steered the conversation away from the snacks and asked me if I wanted to see some pictures of his daughter. He told me he kept them in his glove box, and if I wanted to see them, it would only take a second. Finally, alarms were going off in my stupid head. I declined him and told him I really needed to go right now. He reached a hand out and grabbed me by the arm towards him, repeating over and over again that it would only be a couple of minutes. I panicked and started screaming, trying to yank my arm away. That was just enough of a reaction to start turning heads in the parking lot. The man let go of me and rushed back to his car. Hyperventilating and clutching my bag of snacks, I sprinted to the Taurus, where I was bombarded with questions from my boyfriend and his friends. Apparently, everyone had thought I knew the man, up until I started screaming. They intended to come out and help once they realized what was going on, but the interaction had just ended that fast that they were unable to do anything. For a few hours, I considered reporting the incident to someone, but I figured I didn't have enough info or reasoning to justify it. I still can't help but think what would have happened in that parking lot, had it been a little emptier, or if I'd come alone. A little background information about me to start. I have PD, or panic disorder. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a mental illness that causes extreme anxiety, severe panic attacks, and a slew of other problems. I've been suffering from this for over a year now, and while it is getting better, it's still very difficult to deal with, and keep this in mind. My husband and I have been married for over a year now. During most of the time we've been married, unfortunately, I was undergoing medical issues that no doctors could seem to explain. I was having panic attacks all the time, and it would be so severe I would have to be taken to the ER. They would have to literally sedate me just to calm me down. I was also losing weight at an exponential and very alarming rate, becoming visibly sicker and sicker as time went on. Not even a month after we married, I lost my job and was homebound, while my husband worked a second shift, which was 4 p.m. to 3 a.m. He would arrive home around 4, leaving me alone most of the time. My parents and younger brother did live close by, perhaps a 10-minute drive at most, but at the moment my mother and father were unable to watch over me. They did call as frequently as they could, but that was as much as they could do. In May, I was told by doctors I was literally at death's door, and unless something happened real quick, my family was going to lose me. I was given medications to help with the panic attacks and to get me to eat and the like. They wanted to hospitalize me, but I refused. My parents decided that when they and my younger brother went to Florida the next month, they were taking me with them. Again, keep in mind I was both anxious and extremely sick. At the same time, my real issues had just begun, and not with me either, but with our neighbors. You see, we'd never actually met our neighbors personally before this point. My husband lived in the trailer for a month on his own before we married, and he always said they were a bit odd, but they didn't seem to be of much concern. Once I came into the picture, though, that all changed. The person who'd lived in the trailer before us was actually a cousin of mine, who'd rented from another cousin and his wife who lived states away. Nora was a huge druggie and a drug dealer, so people got real used to getting their fixes and drugs at the trailer we now lived in. A few months before we moved in, she got in trouble with the law and landed in jail for quite some time. I guess our neighbors, who according to our landlords were drug addicts and raging alcoholics as well, thought perhaps that she was back. I'm not quite sure. I suppose this is because I was so sick that they never actually saw who I was. They only knew that I was living there. They became active at night. During the day, they were mostly quiet. Every once in a while, they would do something outside, but for the most part, nothing really happened. It would always start after my husband left for work. My car would still be there, which I guess told them that at least someone was still home. It started off innocently enough, driving up and down in front of the house, parking in the road directly in front of it, and waiting for a long time. Sometimes they'd honk the horn at me, but I just ignored them. Several times I even called my parents because they'd stuck around so long, asking them what to do. They said for the time to just ignore them. Perhaps they thought Nora was back, and after some time they'd get the hint it was new people and leave me alone. So that's exactly what I did for a while. When they started driving up the driveway, though, and stopping at my porch, that's when I first called the cops. All I was told was that as long as they didn't encroach on my actual property, there was nothing they could actually do. They advised me to turn on the lights in my house and signal I was home. Needless to say, I did not sleep very well, despite needing to. My husband had the weekends off, and as you can guess, there were never any issues during the weekends. It was insane and infuriating. Everyone did believe me when I said I was having problems, but there was only so much they could do to help. My father-in-law brought over one of his shotguns, knowing that I was a good shot. He told me to use it if I ever needed it. One night, my husband was at work, and I guess my body finally shut off. I fell asleep for once, only to be awoken around 1 a.m. by the sound of our neighbor's truck tearing out from behind the trailer. I jumped up and looked outside, only to see them shooting out of our driveway. They started speeding up and down in front of the house. I called the cops again. I called my dad and mom, and my dad came over because I was in full panic attack. My dad called my husband, who then came home immediately. They even left tire marks in the grass behind the trailer, but nobody could necessarily prove it was them, despite me describing their truck down to the exact dents. My dad told the cops this had been going on long enough, but again, not enough evidence or proof. A week. Just one more week until I could go with my family to Florida. I somehow managed to be a bridesmaid in my older brother's wedding, despite being so sick. I was doped up on medications to keep me calm, so I wouldn't have a panic attack. I don't recall much about that day other than it rained because of this. My husband, naturally, was at work. When I got back, I was sitting at home and our 2 cats were asleep rather soundly. I was playing my 3DS with the TV on for some background noise. Around midnight, my cats suddenly woke up and became unglued. They ran to the side door, then to the front door, growling and hissing, their hair standing on end. They had never behaved that way before, so I started to get up to see what it was they were freaking out about. And then I heard it. "So, how we gonna do this?" I froze. I heard them. I heard their footsteps as they paced up and down on the front porch. I wasn't sure how many people there were, but I knew for a fact I could hear at least 3 distinct voices. The curtains were closed, and the lights were off, but the TV was on. Surely they could hear it from so close. They got quieter. I heard their footsteps stomping all around. I grabbed my phone, shakily swiping until I found my dad's number, and called him. "Hello? They're here! They're here!" I remember sobbing. "I'm on my way. Call the cops." I hung up on him. Then heard them talking amongst themselves about how they were going to break in, what they wanted. I ran into the bedroom and grabbed the gun. I opened the chamber to see it fully loaded and called the cops myself. I left the lights off. I decided I was going to have them caught this time. I was not going to let them run off. I told them what was going on. As sick as I was, I managed to hold the shotgun to my shoulder pointed at the door, remembering everything my dad had taught me about shooting. I was scared out of my mind, though. I was breathing hard. "Calm your breathing, hun. You said they're outside?" "Yes, I heard one say they heard me, and then the other said it wouldn't be a problem." "Police are on their way, sweetie, I promise. I'm armed." "Excuse me?" "I said I'm armed." I could hear the people outside now talking about that, then silence. I heard their footsteps leaving, then saw the lights to my dad's truck. I lowered the shotgun and ran outside, my dad and younger brother running out of the truck. My dad had his Judge in his hand, which is a pistol that shoots shotgun rounds. My younger brother was holding a knife. I thanked the dispatcher for everything, and about this time the cops pulled up. I told my dad and younger brother to disarm. They put their weapons in the truck while I took my gun inside and put it on the top of the kitchen table. My dad told me to get back in the house, and for my younger brother to go with me. As soon as I stepped inside, the panic attack hit. My dad came inside for a moment and hugged me, telling me how brave I had been, especially for holding it in as long as I did. I listened as he went back outside. The cops found footprints in an area on the porch where apparently the men had tried to break in at one point. They had all scattered, though, leaving it difficult for the cops to trace exactly where they had come from. My dad told them it was the neighbors. My landlords actually called and told the cops it was more than likely them as well. The cops noticed some of the footprints went to the neighbor's yard, but they weren't home, of course. I remember my dad and younger brother standing outside just as the cops pulled up, yelling as loudly as they could that they would drop them if they ever saw them around me again. I noticed my dad was crying as well. He wasn't the type of person to do that. My whole life I've seen my dad cry maybe a handful of times. My dad had been scared he wouldn't get there in time, and maybe I would hesitate to protect myself. I wasn't going to let them get away with this anymore, though. That night, my husband came home from work and hugged me tightly. I thought my lungs would burst because it was so tight. I reassured him I was okay, though. A week later, I went to Florida. Time went on, and I started getting better. As for my neighbors, I never had problems with them again after. I'm not sure if it was the cops actually going to their house, or my dad and younger brother threatening to kill them. Maybe it was me, them hearing me say that I was armed. I don't know, and I don't really care. They're still there, but I don't think they'll try anything ever again. I work at a hospital a town over from where I live, and I work as an environmental service person, aka housekeeping. Every hospital worker has to wear a badge with a picture, first name, and your department listed on it. I'm a 5'2" woman, if that matters at all. I used to park out in the front of the hospital instead of our designated parking space. 1, it was more lit out in the front, and 2, it just seemed more convenient. Now I park in the back in our designated area and walk out with a coworker who leaves at the same time I do. When I get to work, it's still in the early evening, so around 4-ish or so. Normally, we have a few people outside/inside our waiting/wheelchair area. You'll occasionally get a few, "Hey, can you help me with this?" or "Do you know what floor so-and-so is?" People coming up to you because you're wearing scrubs and have a badge is not uncommon or weird, except for this one time. I got to work a little bit early so I could eat before clocking in and just get right to it. I was walking across the little crosswalk from the parking lot to the entrance when I hear a, Miss, could you help me with something?" I turn around and see a decently dressed man in his mid-30s. "Oh, sure, what could I help you with?" "My wife is on the 3rd floor, but I just can't figure out what entrance I'm supposed to use." "Oh, sure, you'll want to use this one, because the one all the way around to the left is for the emergency room. The one all the way to the right is for physical therapy in the senior center." "Okay, thanks. And what time do the doors lock exactly?" 8 o'clock, I believe." He nodded and walked through the doors. I didn't think that much of it, other than if his wife was on the 3rd floor, he should have known what door to use. I mean, it had main entrance written right on the front. I told my shift manager, who radioed to security to maybe keep an eye out for some weirdness. I continued working throughout the day and finally finished my shift. It was around midnight when I finally got outside the doors and halfway through the crosswalk when I heard, "Hey, it's good to see you." I turned around to see the same guy from earlier waiting on the bench outside. I gave a polite nod and continued my way to my car while unlocking my phone. I pulled up my shift manager's office phone number and got ready to call. "Hey, I want to talk to you. Come and chat." "Sorry, it's late, and I have people up and waiting for me at home." "Do you live around here?" "Come on, you're a pretty girl, and I'm a decent guy. Why wouldn't you want to chat?" I ignored him and just continued to walk as fast as I could without running. I could hear him speeding up behind me to follow me. After that sentence, I was about a foot or so away from my car. I pushed my automatic lock and swung my purse off my shoulder so I could chuck it into my car and slam myself in. "Hey!" I slammed my purse in, then slammed myself in, all while locking my doors and slamming my key in, getting ready to leave. He reached my car and pounded his fist on my window. "That's not cool, my name. Let's chat." I'm done talking to this guy at this point. I was seriously ready to just get home. I revved my car, letting him know that if he wasn't going to move, I was going to run over his foot. It was a good thing he was right next to the ER so he could limp over and explain how his foot got in that mess. I pulled my car out of park and slowly, one more time, revved my engine. He knew I was not fucking around. He stepped back and I pulled up to a few parking spaces before speeding out and getting out onto the road. The drive home was spent on the phone with my shift manager, who was radioing security to see if he was still out there and if they could see him anywhere else on location. They couldn't find him, but they did check the cameras. They saw that earlier in the day he'd been following me. Then, after I left, he'd followed me a bit too before meeting me. About 2 minutes after our confrontation, it showed him running away. I spent some time with security, and they told me they were going to forward this all to the police, then to use our designated parking space from now on. They also said to call if I saw him in the building or on shift, or when coming out of work in the future. This story begins about 5 years ago, when I was a junior in high school. There was a boy in my grade, Jack, who didn't have a lot of friends. He's on the lower end of the autism spectrum, what used to be called Asperger's syndrome. That affected his ability to pick up on social cues in his interactions with peers. Although I always knew him to be a bit awkward, he was nice enough, and I felt badly that he spent so much time alone. Eating lunch alone, sitting alone at all the school activities. When he joined theater junior year, an activity I'd been a part of since I was 6, I decided to help in bringing him into the fold. Although more creative clubs do have reputations for being more accepting, it's still a difficult thing to join halfway through when everyone is already close-knit friends with everyone else. I would make my best effort to include Jack in conversations with the groups at rehearsals, talk to him one-on-one, invite him to sit with us at lunch. I even gave him my phone number to chat about things once in a while. When he asked me to hang out with him after a month or so of friendship, I said yes. I came to his family's barn and had a very nice time visiting with all the animals and eating dinner with his family. They said a few heartbreaking things throughout the dinner, like it was so nice to see him finally having a friend. They said they liked me much better than the one other friend he had, who I knew to be a kid who also had some disabilities. Unfortunately, this is around the time when our interactions stopped being healthy. He developed a severe attachment to me. It became very clear to me that he saw me in a romantic way, which I didn't return the feelings. Now that wouldn't have been too problematic if he hadn't started to pursue me in such an obsessive manner. He began texting me every hour of the day. If I ever didn't reply, I would receive another text emphasizing his last, or he would copy and paste the same message over and over again. If it were simply him saying hello to start a conversation, he would post it again and again and again until I finally responded. This was not always me ignoring him, mind you. Sometimes I was at work and unable to respond. Then, when I would unlock my phone, I'd have 10 messages from him like this. Additionally, if I did talk to him, he began pouring out every deep thought to me about depression and even having considered suicide in the past. While I'm a compassionate person who will do anything to help others, this worried me for multiple reasons. One, I'm not a trained therapist, and while I can offer some support, I don't always know the right thing to say to help. The last thing I want to do is say the wrong thing and trigger someone into hurting themselves. Additionally, I feared that him sharing these vulnerable thoughts with me and having me comfort him would make him feel as though the bond between us was closer than it was and cause him to latch on even tighter. I tried my best and advised him to speak to our school guidance counselor, which he declined as he claimed that only I could ever understand him. Around this time, he began following me to work. I didn't have a license at the time, so I had to walk from school to my after-school shifts. The store was less than a mile away, so it didn't really bother me. Jack would find me at my locker and start talking to me on my walk to the front door of the school building. I would say, "Bye, I have to go to work," but instead of waiting for his ride, he would follow behind me through the parking lot, down the street, and the entire way to where I worked. As the store I worked at is one where the customers come up to the counter and can't come inside, he would just lurk around in the parking lot for 20 minutes to half an hour, never buying anything, before eventually turning around and walking back to the school. My manager and I were both very disturbed by this whenever it happened, and I would hide in the back or clean until he left. Then the performance of our musical came, and the creep factor amped up even more. He was still constantly texting me, of course, but at this point I was going through a lot of mental health issues of my own. I didn't really have the patience to deal with this constant bothering. I replied every few days or so, but I wouldn't engage in more than casual conversation. He began to incessantly comment on everything I posted, Instagram, Facebook, responding to every single tweet. In person, he also followed me around constantly. More than once, he'd attempted to barge into the girls' dressing room and made several comments about my body and specifically my breasts to my face during that week. He happened to leave his phone on a table by me, and when I went to return it, I saw his lock screen was a photo that said, "Boobs are like the sun. If you wear sunglasses, you can stare at them as long as you like." As soon as the musical was over, I didn't have to see him on a regular basis and decided to block him on everything. His constant replies were really starting to freak me out. I told him multiple times that I couldn't always be there to talk to him, but he never listened. I blocked his number. Summer was actually quiet. I enjoyed the fact I didn't have to see or hear from him for a long time. Unfortunately, the school year brought back some contact with him, as he was now a recurring member of theater. He tried to confront me about blocking him in front of a large group of people. I just said we could talk about it later, and he failed to bring it back up. 2 weeks later, though, I got a Twitter notification that my phone contact Jack had joined Twitter as a user posing as the school debate team. I also had a notification saying he'd followed me. He made a fake account for a club that didn't even exist at school just in order to follow me. To my advantage, he'd used his real phone number or email when making that account. Therefore, I was able to quickly block him and told my close friends to do the same. For most part, my senior year went mostly quiet, except for an incident where he'd parked right next to me and tried to hit my car. I'm somewhat sure it was just because he's a really bad driver, but I've always had a tinge of doubt in my mind. I wish I could say the story ended there, that his crush just faded out with high school graduation, and the blocks on his account and number gave him enough closure to move on. Fast forward to fall of 2017. It's been about 2.5 years since I graduated from high school. I was going through my account on Twitter and adjusting some things, and saw I still had some people set to notifications that I didn't really talk to anymore. Some people I'd blocked from old grudges that I'd long since gotten over. I saw Jack was still blocked, and figured that everything had occurred so long ago that he must be over it by now. I decided to unblock him, assuming the chances would be rare he would comment or do anything. Likes are innocent enough. How wrong I was. In my defense, it did take him quite a while to notice. Whether I just didn't pop up on his timeline for some time, or he just didn't use those applications for a while. I didn't hear from him until spring of 2018, 3 years after we'd left high school. He commented on something I posted, trying to start an argument. When I responded, he said he could never win an argument against me. Seemed innocent enough. I liked his comment and moved on. The next day, I got a message from him. "I see you're still the same as you were in high school." I responded for a bit and then stopped replying. It was only small talk, but I didn't want to contact him any further. I had a sinking feeling he was falling back in his old pattern. The next day, I got another message. Hey, are you there? I need to tell you something really important. I was taking a nap at the time, so I couldn't respond. 10 minutes later, according to the timestamp, he DM'd me the same message on Instagram and Twitter. Another 5 minutes later, I get the same message as a text, even though I didn't have his number. At this point, all the notifications woke me up. I was annoyed and felt I knew what he was going to say. I had a huge crush on you in high school, and I still do now. At this point, I was enraged. I hadn't seen him in 3 years, or interacted with him at all during that time. He made my favorite activity stressful and uncomfortable for me. He followed me to work several times. He knows nothing about the person I'd developed into in the years since I graduated. I decided to do what I hadn't done at that point, which was explicitly tell him about how inappropriate everything he'd done was. I knew he had a disability that made it hard for him to tell how people felt about things he said or did, and that's why I felt I needed to be brutally honest. I decided clearly he had some kind of fixation on me that seemed to transcend the boundaries of distance, time, or sight, so I blocked and deleted him on everything since. So this event happened to me back when I was 20 and was going back from my aunt's house, where I'd give lessons to my little cousins each week. I was a student back then, and it happened in winter, when it was quickly dark around 5 p.m. I must also say I'm a woman, and unfortunately that's not very helpful when it's getting dark out. I was going back to the train station to take the direction home, because I lived quite a few stations away from my aunt. At that time, it was around 6 already. It was really dark and cold outside. I remember being particularly tired too, so I didn't give much attention to the direction the train I was waiting for was going to. As soon as it rolled in, I went inside. It was really crowded, so I stood up for quite some time. That didn't help much with how tired I already was. After some time, a seat finally cleared up. I snapped it up as fast as I could. I let out a heavy sigh that attracted the attention of the people beside me. I was a little ashamed by that, so I just looked down at my phone and didn't pay much attention to the others for the rest of my ride. At some point, though, I noticed the guy in front of me looking really intensely right at me. Then again, I was so tired I didn't really think much about it. I just continued watching whatever was on my phone at the time. As we rolled into a station, the train stopped, and the driver informed us that was the last stop. I had my headphones on, so I didn't hear the entire message. I thought I had to stay on the same train and it would just go back on the same line after a few minutes. While everyone else went out, I just switched places to go somewhere with no one beside me. It was a seat comfortably near the window. When the train was soon to start again, the man that was looking at me earlier walked straight into my zone and sat right in front of me. I was focused on my phone, though, and didn't pay much attention to him. It was quite strange, though. The entire wagon was empty where I was. There were tons of empty seats where he could have sat, but he chose right next to me. The train started up again, and I was happy to finally be able to approach my home. As some stations passed by, though, I noticed something odd. The stations were the ones I'd already passed by before. In fact, the train was going back to the direction of my aunt's house, not where I lived. I realized I hadn't heard the message right in the first place. I was a little bit angry because of this, but most importantly, I laughed at myself. It was the first time I was so tired I'd done such a mistake. As I was smiling at my own foolishness, I started to look around me. I saw the man sat before me. He was looking confused, while switching his gaze between me and the windows. I laughed and gave him a small smile. I thought he'd also gone in the wrong direction too, since he had been in the same train for a long time now with me. But he didn't smile back. Instead, he glared at me and got very angry. I remember getting a chill at that moment. My senses finally woke up to make me realize there was something wrong with this man. I stopped the video I'd been watching and started to think. I had two options. The first one was to just stop at the next station, change sides to take the train that would actually get me home. That was the most logical and normal option. I didn't know why, but something in my gut told me I shouldn't go home alone tonight because of the man in front of me. I decided to stay on the train instead and see if he would get off before me or not. After all, I was sure this was not his direction either. I stayed. At least 4 stations passed by, but he didn't move at all. Instead, he seemed to get much more confused and angry with each passing station. He was glaring at me a lot, switching to the windows each station, as if he was waiting to see which one I would get off on. Now he was giving me a real scary look. I tried to avoid his gaze as much as possible. At some point, he started to push his leg against mine. It's like when the train is riding fast, and because of its movements, you sometimes touch people near you and bump slightly into them when it's crowded. Him doing that was not natural, though, because the train was almost empty. After some time, I was really getting awkward. Even when I changed position to be away from him, he would constantly rub his legs up against mine. It pissed me off. I looked straight at him, and then I knew immediately I was in danger. He was looking at me with this huge smile on his face. Since he'd noticed, I was now reacting. I was terrified. When the train stopped again at a station, I didn't really think. I jumped out of my seat and started to go out. He followed behind me. I was really scared. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want him to follow me home because I lived in a really secluded place. If he were to follow me all the way, at some point he would be able to do anything to me. Near my own home, there would be no one around to hear or help me. I was trying to think fast, when suddenly I got an idea. I stayed near the train before the door closed and walked near it like nothing happened. He was still following me and looking at me, but I tried to remain calm. When I heard the sound of the door about to close, I jumped back inside the train again. Right when the door was closing, he couldn't get in on time. I saw him looking at the closing doors in shock. He looked at me like he wanted to kill me. I went back to my seat and stared out the window looking at him to see what he would do. He was so furious. I was scared he was going to break the glass and jump right at my neck. The train finally started again. It was gradually pulling away from the platform. The man was staring at me, following me with his gaze the entire time. When the train finally passed that station, I started breathing normally again. After that, I stayed on a few stations and finally got off and changed sides to take a train in the direction of my home. I was looking behind me the whole time and ran home as fast as I could. It was only when I was in my room that I fully realized what had happened. That event was really a change for me. Before that, I was really carefree when I took the train or the subway. But from that time on, I started being a lot more cautious of my surroundings, especially when returning home at night. So this happened around 2 years ago, when I was 20 years old. Backstory, I'm quite small actually. I was doing some shopping in town alone. I remember it was a warm Sunday afternoon. People were out and about with their families, and it was quite busy in the city center. I had some free time to myself, so I decided to pay my grandma a visit. To get to her place, you needed to take a 20-minute bus ride from where I was. On to the story now. I was waiting there for my bus to arrive when I noticed a man staring at me. He didn't seem to be much older than I was. I remember he had on this very peculiar bright yellow hat as well. I usually don't care when someone looks at me, but this man was sort of looking at me like he was angry, like I had done something to offend him. Most people at the bus stop were either facing traffic or looking at the coming buses, but not this man. He had his back to the street and was just staring at me angrily. I got a weird feeling because of this. Still though, I saw my bus coming very soon and hoped he wouldn't get on as well. Of course, he followed on right behind me. I quickly slid into a window seat. Luckily for me, there was a kindly old lady sat next to me. She acted as a bit of a shield between me and this guy. The man stood next to our seat almost the entire ride, except for occasionally pacing around a couple of times. I was already quite freaked out by his behavior. I was texting my at-the-time boyfriend throughout the event. While he hadn't actually done anything to me, I was getting a really bad gut feeling about this guy. A few stops before mine, Unfortunately, the old lady had to depart from the bus. At this point, the man's behavior became even stranger. He sat down next to me, of course, which made me tense up right away. I refused to even look at my phone or text anyone in case he saw me typing something he could use to look me up later. I think he sensed he was making me tense up. He got back and went to standing next to my seat and staring at me. My stop came and I waited to the very last moment to get off. Of course, he also got off as well. What followed confirmed he was indeed after me. I guess in an attempt to put me off again, he ran ahead of me on the road, glancing back the entire way. Luckily for me though, him doing so gave me my only out from the situation. If he would have kept walking behind me, I would have been forced to either make a run for the apartment door and hope I was fast enough to close it before he got there, or run in a random direction and hope I reached a safe place before he did. I was out of the city center now, and there weren't many people around to help me. Because he decided to run ahead and wait for me though, in that split moment I decided to turn around and run in the other direction and dial my mom. It was pretty bad, but I decided to call my mom in case anything happened to me, so she would know who it was. I told my mom what was happening. Down the road, I spotted this small burger place. They would surely have a security guard. My mom told me to run for there and tell them what was going on. I ran as fast as I could. I saw the man had now turned around and noticed me going the other direction. He began fully sprinting after me. I was almost ready to cry. Luckily, I reached the burger place before he caught me. From the window, I could see him sprinting across the road. I guess him seeing me get into the place, though, threw him off. I have no idea why he fixated on me, why he seemed so angry, or what his plans were if he caught me, and I'm not sure I want to know. In 2010, I was living in Quincy, Massachusetts with my husband, a new baby, and a roommate. It was a Saturday, so I was taking a much-needed break from the little one and went to run some errands and have some alone time. My first stop was to the local Radio Shack to get a phone accessory. After my purchase, I walked out in deep thought about my to-do list, enjoying being Sans baby for a day, when a voice broke through my reverie. Excuse me, miss, could you help me for a moment? I blinked in confusion and looked over at the man who just addressed me. My first impression of him was Italian grandpa. Everything about him was beige. His khaki slacks, his cardigan and tweed flat cap, his sandy-colored mustache even. Even the car he stood next to, a boat-sized town car, was a similar color. I hesitated a bit. As a big believer in the golden rule, I generally tried to help people out whenever I could. But this time, something about this situation gave me a bit of pause. I stood there in the middle of the parking lot. What did you need help with? I asked. The man smiled warmly. I think there's something wrong with my car. He held out his key fob. Whenever I click my car key, the door locks won't lock. It's very strange. You probably know more about this stuff than I do. Can you come over and take a look for me real quick? He gestured over to his car and clicked the fob in demonstration. Still hesitating, I said, I don't know anything about cars. We're right here at Radio Shack, though. Maybe they can help you out. No. I think we can figure this out together. Come on, give it a quick look. Again, I repeated I didn't think I could help him. I could see he was getting very agitated, and yet he continued to force a smile. He walked over to the back of his car and popped open the trunk. Here's the strangest thing, though. The doors don't lock, but the trunk still will. He started waving at me eagerly. Come on, come take a look. I began to feel very confused. Part of me wanted to go over and help still, but my greater instincts prevailed. I began to walk away, repeating over and over to the man, I can't help you, just go inside and ask for help. As I started to walk away, I saw him throw his arms up in anger. He slammed down the trunk, hopped in his car, and drove away. I drove on to my next errand, feeling very unsettled. As I tried to process the encounter, I began to have doubts about my reaction, though. Maybe he really was just an old man that needed help. Did I do the right thing? When I returned home, I shared the encounter with my husband and roommate. I expected they'd laugh and assure me I was being overly paranoid. Instead, they looked at me with wide eyes. Apparently, this is a very common plot to try and kidnap someone in the area I'm from. I didn't report the incident to the police, as I didn't get useful information regarding the license plate number. I didn't think a man asking for help with his car counted as harassment in the moment. On a lark, I decided to Google attempted kidnappings in Quincy, in hopes that my search would turn up empty, that this would be a truly innocent, if awkward, encounter. Imagine my dismay when actual articles talking about this sort of thing popped up. I found a particular one and immediately recognized the perpetrator as that same man from the Radio Shack parking lot. A follow-up article revealed he actually lived in my old neighborhood. I often wonder if I was one of his first attempts at kidnapping, and what would have happened to me if I had gone over to look in his trunk. Hey guys, before this first story gets started, I wanted to go ahead and let you know that there is some animal cruelty and animal death in this first story. So if you're not comfortable with that sort of thing, you can go ahead and take a look in the comments or the description below, and there will be a timestamp for you to skip ahead to the second story. So go ahead and do that if you're not comfortable with that sort of thing. Thanks for the understanding. When I was 16, I got my first job at a local fast food restaurant. Of course, since I was in school during the day, I had to work a second shift job. I was hoping that by working, I would be able to save up some money to buy my own car. Until then, however, I had to walk home to the restaurant when I got off work. It really wasn't that bad, since the restaurant was in the town I lived in anyway. The walk was maybe a little over half an hour or so. The only bad thing about it really was that I had to walk past this lightly wooded area that always gave me the creeps. It was pretty dark as well and not fenced off, which made it even freakier to me. Both of my parents worked early in the morning, and even if they didn't, they likely wouldn't have come to pick me up anyway, since it was such a short walk. One Friday night in the middle of summer, I had just gotten out of work. It was around midnight, since the store had closed at 11 p.m. I got everything cleaned up and began my walk home. It was a really nice night out actually, as I was walking along the town street. The sky was extremely clear, and I found myself constantly looking up at the constellations. They were particularly bright tonight. I was looking forward to arriving home and taking a long shower, then maybe playing some video games before going to bed. I did begin to get a little apprehensive though, as I walked by that wooded area. It was right by a road that led away from the main town road and off to a housing area that I lived in. It wasn't even that far to go really. It bugged me though because there were no street lamps at all in that area. It got very dark very quickly, and I wouldn't get light again until I turned onto the next street where the houses were. I made the turn onto that dark wooded street and tried my best to pace myself as I walked along. Hurrying surely wasn't going to help me. For some reason, I found I always got a lot more frightened whenever I tried to run or hurry. Not sure why. I guess if someone saw me running, I would have been quite humiliated. 16-year-olds really shouldn't be so scared that they try to run down the street though. That's what I told myself. It wasn't like anyone would have seen me anyway being so late at night, but for some reason right now, I still felt like I was being watched. "Hey, kid!" I heard a voice off to the side of me call out. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It took everything I had in me not to just take off running down the road. Turning around though, I looked and didn't see anyone there at all. All I could see was a bunch of wooded area and trees. As I was trying to look a bit closer, a man suddenly stepped out from behind one of them. I kid you not. He was dressed exactly like a ringmaster from a circus. He was wearing a black top hat and a red jacket with white pants on. He was very neat for having just been in the woods, and he had this big smile plastered across his face. Hey there," I responded. I shuffled on my feet, not really knowing what to do. "Come over here, kid," the man called to me. "I want to show you something." I didn't really want to go anywhere near this guy. He didn't make any moves toward me, but he was really creepy. Sorry, I'd best be on my way home now," I told him, and started to walk a little quicker down the street. "Come on, kid, it'll only take a second. I want to show you something real cool." Now, I know that everyone reading this will just think it would have been stupid for me to not keep walking, but I'd never really been good at conflict, and I didn't know how to feel in awkward situations either. I motioned again I was just gonna walk home. Once again, the man gestured for me to come to him, and indicated he really wanted to show me something. Against my better judgment, I found myself turning over towards the man. I figured if I just waited there, I could tell what he was up to without getting too close to him. He noticed that I had walked slightly towards him, and his already wide grin grew even wider. I didn't plan on going any further than this though, just close enough to see what it was he was supposedly trying to show me. I wanted to stay as far away as possible. I stopped a fair bit of the way across the street from the guy. "Come on, kid, come closer. I need to show you something." "I think you can show me from where I'm standing," I told him. I was being foolhardy, I admit, but I could still draw the line between foolhardy and completely dumb. The man looked very disappointed, but his smile only faltered a little bit. It didn't fade completely. "Alright, well, I suppose that's close enough. I'll go get it." The man walked back behind the tree line and was out of sight for a moment. I thought about just leaving while he was back there, but I just stood there, afraid to move. The man was only gone for a moment, but when he came back from behind the tree, he had something vile in his hand. It looked like he had sewn the top half of a dead chihuahua onto the bottom half of a fish, and he didn't do a good job at it either. It was covered in dried blood, and one of the dog's eyes was hanging out of its socket. The man smiled at me. "I found a Fiji mermaid." I took off and ran my butt off. I didn't stop until I got home. Rather than save it for a car, I used my money to buy a bicycle so I could ride home instead. One of the worst decisions I made in my entire life was on the commute to my college. At first, it seemed like a really good idea, as I drove 5 miles to the train station to take it into the city. I could do any last-minute studying on the train, which I took much advantage of. Once I got into the city, I'd just take the bus to school. It sucked having to get up so early to do all of this, sure, but it was worth it in the end. Or at least worth it up until the worst thing happened. My car stopped working. I didn't really know enough about cars in order to fix it. I also didn't have enough money to take it to a mechanic either. Even worse, I didn't have any family in the area that could loan me money or drive me over to the train. I was also past the point where I could drop any classes either. If I didn't find a way to get to school, I would be failing them this semester. After racking my brain about how I was going to get there, I realized I really only had one choice now. I would have to get up earlier in the morning and just walk on over to the train station. Walking 5 miles was not the biggest steel rally. I could easily do 7 at the gym on the treadmill. But walking along the side of the road where people drive along was much harder than walking or running on a treadmill in a gym. It wasn't like in class where it was just 5 miles one way. It would also be 5 miles home after school. But I didn't really have a choice now, did I? The first few days were not that bad, really. Although when I got home at night, my feet were like lead bricks in my shoes. By the time the first week came around, it was beginning to get to be too much. I had one late class on Thursday, too, which meant I would be walking 5 miles in complete darkness. At least it would be somewhat easier than walking with the burning sun, I supposed. When I got out of the train that night, I set out to walk home like usual. My feet were already throbbing and sobbing before I even got out of the parking lot. There weren't many cars in the road, which I actually found to be quite a relief. It was sort of embarrassing to have to be walking home alone like that. After I'd gotten about a mile down the road, though, I was feeling pretty terrible. What seemed to be the best possible thing happened right at that moment. A black luxury car pulled off the road and onto the shoulder. The driver rolled down his window and asked me if I needed a ride. I was so happy and relieved. I, of course, accepted. He motioned for me to hop in the passenger side. I went and got in, and he had me buckle up my seatbelt before he drove off. Although I really appreciated this ride, I had to admit the whole situation was rather uncomfortable. Being in the car with someone I didn't know at all, he was actually much bigger than me too. It was not a pleasant feeling. The man asked me where I was going, and when I told him, he nodded. He asked me what I was doing walking around so late at night in the middle of nowhere. I explained my whole situation to him. He nodded. He knew where we were going and told me he had been in the area for quite a while. After this short talk, the man basically stopped talking to me altogether. He just stared straight ahead and didn't speak another word to me. It was kind of unnerving, actually. I felt like I should try to talk to him at least a little bit, considering he was doing me a really huge favor right now. But it seemed like he didn't want to have anything to do with me. Therefore, I just kept quiet and looked forward the entire rest of the ride as well. Though very short, it was dreadful. It seemed like much longer than a 4-mile drive. I lived down a road with a few other houses on it, and everyone had already gone to bed by the time the car pulled up. I pointed my house out to the man. He drove me to it, but stopped before he got to the driveway. When he pulled over, I was very eager to get out of the car and be on my way. I grabbed my book bag with my right hand and was about to get out when the man finally reacted to me. After I opened the latch, the man, who was absolutely huge, reached over with his right hand and gripped my wrist tight. He grabbed it so hard it actually started to hurt a lot. I cried out in pain. I looked over to the man, who I now saw had a completely crazed look in his eye. I asked him to please let go of me, and he just began to laugh at me. I struggled against him, and he held me very firmly in place. I was freaked out now. I wasn't sure what to do in this situation. "Please stop it," I asked the man. "The ride wasn't free, you know," was all the man said. To my horror, while he still held my wrist firmly, probably giving me bruises, he did something even more terrifying. He reached down with his left hand, and he slowly undid his fly. My eyes grew as large as plates while I watched. The guy reached into his pants. I yelled at him to stop and tried to tell him I wasn't gay, not that it mattered at all. I also tried yelling for help, but the houses on my street were so spread apart it was unlikely anyone would come to my aid. With strength much greater than mine, the man started moving my hand closer to him. I kept on trying to pull away, using every bit of strength I had. It was really starting to hurt now with how firmly he was holding me. I dreaded the idea of even having to touch this guy, but not knowing what else to do, I did the only thing I could think of. I was still trying to pull away. Part of the strength was used to keep trying to move my wrist down as well. In a flash, I shifted my force downward, along with the force he was already using to move my hand. It ended up with him slamming his own fist right into his balls so hard that he yelled and let go of my arm. I was pleased. Thankfully, I hadn't had to come into any kind of contact with him. I immediately grabbed my things and jumped out of the door and made a mad sprint to my house. As I tried to grab my keys out, I looked behind me. I saw the man struggling to get out of the car as well. Fortunately, I was able to get my keys out and get in the house before the man could get to me. I grabbed my phone and screamed that I was calling the police. He hopped in his car and took off like a bat out of hell. I breathed about 20 sighs of relief in that moment. The following day, I put up an ad on a school bulletin board advertising for a rideshare on the way home. I found one so quickly, in fact, that I kicked myself for being stupid and not having simply done that before. I guess it's important to know I'm a female before going any further into this story. I had a bit of bad luck when I bought a battery for my last car. No more than a month after I'd purchased it, the engine somehow got a crack in it. I couldn't afford to fix it at the time, and honestly, the car was so old anyway, it probably wouldn't have even been worth the money to do so. It wasn't like I desperately needed a car at the moment, so I wasn't in too much of a hurry to get it replaced right away. It did bug me, however, that I'd recently paid $80 for a car battery that could no longer be used. Because of this, I decided to put that battery up for sale on Craigslist. I didn't get too many bites on it though until I lowered it all the way down to $30. It seemed like a big waste, but I guess it would have been an even bigger waste to not get anything for it. A guy who lived much closer to Chicago than I did answered the ad. He told me he would drive up to the town I lived in to come get the battery from me. I got my multimeter out because I wanted to show the buyer that the battery was still in good shape. Then I waited for him to show up. Honestly, I was nervous about the entire thing. It was so much more personal than selling something on eBay. In fact, I'd only ever sold things on there because it was so impersonal. With eBay, no one ever had to come to my house to pick something up. I was kind of uncomfortable knowing someone would actually have to come to my home. It took the guy an awfully long time to get there, too. I was waiting nearly 2.5 hours for him to make a drive that should have taken less than 40 minutes. Of course, when the guy finally showed up, he gave me the creeps right away. He pulled up in this rickety-ass pickup truck that looked like he'd pulled it straight out of a hillbilly horror flick, and he looked just as bad as his truck did. It was almost impossible for me to tell how old he was. He was dressed very shoddily and looked and smelled like he hadn't bathed in over a year. The moment he saw me, he started giving me the eye. You know, the once-over. You know it. You name it, and he was giving it to me. He didn't shy away from making it very obvious he was interested. The man walked up and I took out the multimeter because I wanted to show him the battery was still working fine. He told me I didn't really have to do that, but still I insisted. He made me very uncomfortable, and I wanted to have as few reasons as possible for him to try and come back. I took the meter. The battery registered as over 12.6 volts, indicating that everything was fine. The entire time, though, I could see this man was paying much more attention to me than to what I was doing. The man then had the nerve to try and talk me down from the $30 I had on the price. He told me he had driven a long way through traffic just to get there, and it had cost him a lot of gas and money. I insisted, though, that 30 was the absolute lowest I was willing to go. I was already losing money on this. That's when the man winked at me and leaned in. Well, maybe I could work the rest of the money off another way. Never before had the words, "I'm not gay, but I guess I'll learn," wanted to come out of my mouth so badly. Instead, I politely declined and did everything I could to get the man to just leave. I decided the only way I was going to get away from this was to simply walk away and see what happened. I went into the house. The man actually stood outside for several minutes before he got into that disgusting truck and drove off. I was relieved he was gone now. Now I would never have to see this creepy guy ever again. At first, I thought maybe I was just being too hard. Maybe I judged the guy too much based on his looks alone. His attitude later changed my opinion, though. I was not being hard on him at all. In fact, I was being quite easy. The guy was a creep. About 2 hours later, my cell phone blew up. I looked, and there was a notification that I got an email from the guy. It read, "The battery was dead. Gonna bring it back for a refund." The battery had most certainly not been dead. He knew it, and I knew it. I realized the only reason he was claiming it had to be because he wanted to come back and see me again. I texted him that I wasn't comfortable with him coming to my house. Besides, he saw the test and it had worked just fine. I sent the email and waited for a response. I didn't get one. I was quite relieved because the creep must have realized his ploy did not work. A few weeks passed by after, and I pretty much forgot about the encounter. I was really craving some ice cream and thought I'd stroll on to the gas station and get myself an ice cream sandwich. Yeah, it was really dark, but I'd made that walk hundreds of times before. It wasn't too big of a deal. I got my ice cream bar and left the gas station. While I was walking home, I walked along the main road, until I got to the entrance to the subdivision my house was in. I froze when I turned onto that street and saw that same old truck that creep had driven several weeks before. This time, though, he wasn't in it. It was parked off to the side of the road, but it was undoubtedly his truck. I started to turn around and walk back to the store when I realized I didn't know if that man was in front of or behind me. I looked back and forth, freaked out and confused as to what I should do. Finally, I realized I had only the choice to go forward. I cautiously crept past that truck, my eyes darting from side to side as I expected something to happen. When I was just past it, I kept shooting glances back behind me to see if he was following me. I was agitated the entire walk home. Rather stupidly, I decided not to bring my cell phone with me this night, so I couldn't call anyone for help, and I couldn't use the flashlight either. Walking down the street towards my house in the darkness was the worst part. When I got closer to my home, I noticed that something was amiss. I ran up to the house, only to find my front window had been smashed in by something. Freaked out, I ran around to the door, which was still locked. When I went inside, I saw what had been used to break the window was the same car battery that guy had taken with him. There was a note scrawled to it, which read this: "I've been watching you every day for 3 weeks, and I'm gonna get my money back for this dead battery before I rip the hell out of you." Scared to death, I went and grabbed a knife out of the kitchen, then proceeded to call the police. They got there before anything happened, but the truck had already left by then. I felt stupid for not taking down the license plate, because all I had was an email and that wouldn't do any good. The police couldn't do anything. That happened about 3 months ago. I kept on wondering what was going to happen to me, and if I would ever see that man again. Whenever I'm in my house, I keep the kitchen knife with me just in case. My last experience on Craigslist was not a particularly nice one. The last time I used it to sell something, I had to phone the police because the man kept showing up to my door, asking for anything else I had for sale. I only sold a few items, but he always just kept appearing around my property. That's a mistake I made when I gave out my address. I needed to sell some baby clothes now, though, since my daughter had outgrown them. I had stopped using Craigslist around this time and found a new app instead. I posted them on OfferUp and got a lot of offers. Mostly they were no-shows, until Wednesday, when I got a message from another person asking about the clothes. I agreed to meet them somewhere nearby. It seemed they were only 2 miles away. That's the beauty of this app, you see. You get to see who's close by, and you also get to see a face because you can log in through Facebook. Anyway, I agreed to meet at a Toys R Us store in the parking lot. As I was waiting, I got a message through OfferUp. Another good thing, I didn't have to give out my phone number on this app. The car that pulled up was not what I had expected. There were 5 people stuffed into this car. I expected the woman to get out because that's who I assumed wanted the clothes. Instead, she just sat there, staring at me, then looking to each of the other people. She didn't get out of the car. Instead, it was a buff 6'5" dude, all tattered up and bald with a nasty goatee. He walked right up to my window and asked if I had the baby clothes. I'm a very small woman, and I didn't have any protection on me. Imagine this guy approaching me. He proceeded to jiggle the handle of my car, asking me to hurry up and show him. I was terrified at this point. Like, what the fuck? Don't just touch my door. He did it again, though, and I politely told him to just step back and give me a moment. As I opened the trunk of my car to retrieve those clothes, the next thing that happened surprised me. As I went around back to retrieve them, I was shoved face first into the trunk of my own car. "What the hell?" I yelled, as the man proceeded to shove me into my car trunk. It felt like someone else was behind me as well. I heard the rustling of bags and someone else taking the clothes. I heard the big guy telling whoever was with him to hurry up. I yelled as loud as I could for help and tried to get the license plate number as well. The description of the car was an old Honda from the early 2000s, green with tinted windows. My baby clothes were gone as well. I filed the police report and told them the make and model of this vehicle. I also gave them the Facebook profile of the person who had asked about the clothes. When the police followed up with me, they'd arrested 3 people, including that big ignorant ass that took my baby clothes. The clothes were never recovered, and I have yet to get back on OfferUp. It seems like I just can never get a break on these things. Please be careful when you use these sorts of services. I'm not saying don't use them at all, but I've had some pretty rough experiences. There's a lot of shady stuff going on there. I guess the good thing is it's easy enough to be traced if you sign in through Facebook. Before I start, let me just say this story is pretty weird. I needed a TI-84 calculator for my college statistics class. The damnedest thing is that they're really expensive, so I decided to go ahead and purchase one on Craigslist. Looking through all the ads, I finally found one that seemed almost too good to be true. A guy was selling a relatively new one for only $40. I immediately emailed the seller and was happy to see the calculator was still up for sale. I asked when I could come by and get it, and the seller said right away if I wanted to. He gave me his address and I headed off for his home. The house itself was quite a bit of ways out of town. I'm in a college town in the middle of a bunch of cornfields anyway, and the place I drove to was an old farmhouse sitting there alone. This person had a nice big yard, and there were cornfields all around as far as the eye could see. I drove up the needlessly long driveway and didn't see any vehicles there. Apprehensively, I got out of the car and walked up to the porch and knocked on the door. I had to knock on it several times. After I did, the door was finally answered by a guy who looked like he belonged working in the carnies, rather than living out on a farm like this. He was tall and skinny with pallid skin and dark eyes set back in his sockets. He looked at me for a few moments and kept rolling his tongue around in his cheek. Yeah, I'm here about the calculator," I said. The man just kinda gave me an odd look before nodding. He held it up and let me look at it. It looked pretty great, honestly. I turned it on, tried it out, everything seemed to work perfectly. I took the money out to hand to the man, only for him to act as if he'd just remembered something. "Oh, sorry, I forgot to get the cover. Why don't you come on inside for a moment and I'll grab it for you?" This was pretty odd. I didn't want to just go into this guy's house. The guy was kind of being weird. Looking past him into the home, I could see it was quite dirty and unkempt as well. I declined, but the man insisted. "Come on, no reason to stand out here in the cold. It'll just be a moment so I can find the cover." Cold? I thought it wasn't even remotely cold outside. It was creepy enough being asked to enter the home for something as simple as a calculator cover, but his excuse made it that much worse. No thanks, it's okay. I'll just wait out here." I told him I could just play here for a moment. At first, the man just kind of stared at me with his dark eyes. Then he reached out to grab the calculator out of my hand and slammed the door right in my face. Needless to say, I was extremely confused. I had already paid for the calculator. Was he just not going to give it to me? I stood there for a few moments, unsure of what to do. Suddenly, he opened the door again, holding the calculator with the cover on it this time. He held it out to me. When I didn't move, he got very impatient and started to growl at me. "Well, take the damn thing, you just paid for it." I took the calculator out of his hand, and he slammed the door right in my face. Happy to be out of conversation with this person, and eager to get away as fast as possible, I turned away. As I turned, though, I caught a glimpse in the window and saw that he was not alone. There was a person who had been hidden just out of sight, and they were arguing about something. I'd had enough, though. I ran to my car and left. When I got back to my room, I decided to try this new calculator out. I hoped that the guy hadn't gotten so angry he'd broken it or something. I turned it on. Now, anyone that has used this calculator knows you can type in letters as well as numbers, and whatever you put on the screen will come right back on once the calculator is turned on after sleep mode. When I turned the calculator on, it seemed there was a message for me. The man must have written it when he was inside looking for the cover. "If you had come in, you'd be dead right now. Enjoy your calculator.